20. Winter crouched by the metal hatch outside the landing grotto. She held a blaster pistol in one hand, knowing her white hair and light robes would make her easily visible even in the dimness. 4 huge mechanical assault transports picked their way over the wreckage to the left blast door and halted with hissing engines in the middle of the grotto. Transparent steel canopies flipped up with a high-pitched whir to disgorge stormtroopers. Flicking her eyes from side to side, Winter took a quick inventory. Each of the 4 spider walkers carried 2 troopers, 8 targets. She steadied her blaster and aimed at the nearest white-armored soldier. Winter fired off 3 shots in quick succession. She couldn't tell how many actually hit the trooper, but he flew backward with his armor blasted to pieces. Other soldiers boiled out of the transports, firing in her direction. Winter hunched down, but could not get another shot in. The last spider walker opened up to reveal 1 stormtrooper and a squat man with huge eyebrows and thick lips. The other troopers had pinpointed Winter's position next to the door and hammered repeated blasts at her. She backed toward the open hatch. Winter had 2 choices. She could either run back and stay with Anakin to defend him with her life, or she could lure the 7 remaining invaders away from the baby and do her best to dispose of them. Winter squeezed the firing button of her blaster without aiming. Bright streaks ricocheted around the grotto. The squat man ducked under the low-slung cockpit of a spider walker. "Go get her!" he yelled. One of the stormtroopers still in the cockpit of an MT-AT brought laser cannons to bear and shot at the wall beside her head, leaving a smoking crater. The squat man screamed from his hiding place under the MT-AT. "Don't kill her! You stun until you have the child! You!" He gestured to the trooper who had emerged from the spider walker with him. "Come with me. We'll provide reconnaissance. The rest of you, capture that woman." Exactly as Winter had hoped. She fled down the corridor, knowing that most of the assault team would follow her. She sped along the sloping tunnels, ducking low through jagged entryways, slamming heavy airlock doors behind her as she passed into a deeper level of the installation. The stormtroopers followed, making short work of the thick hatches by using focused thermal detonators that blasted the metal doors out of their seams. Winter led them through the labyrinth of passages, farther and farther away from baby Anakin. The stormtroopers would be completely disoriented by now. The troopers fired whenever they got a clear shot, but Winter managed to avoid being blasted to pieces. She heaved a sigh of relief, the only emotional release she allowed herself, when she finally succeeded in leading the troopers into the subterranean generator room and computer core. The chamber itself was a dim morass of tangled equipment, cooling ducts, metal pipes, and throbbing life support systems. The computer core glowed with oblong green lights that flickered in a waterfall pattern. The computers themselves, incorporated into the pumping stations and generator housing, formed a surrealistic cluster of twisted metal and plastic, and a confusion of transparent steel diagnostic screens, input-output terminals, more equipment than anyone could possibly fathom a purpose for. Winter knew the equipment was just stage dressing to hide the real purpose of the chamber. The troopers hesitated at the threshold, as if suspecting a trap within the shadows. Winter pointed her blaster and fired 7 rapid shots at them. The stormtroopers dived for cover, and then, when Winter did not fire again, charged into the dim room after her. Winter did not try to hide. She ran to the glowing pillar of the computer core and then into shadows on either side of the chamber, surrounded by conduits and tubes and flashing lights that served no purpose. The stormtroopers moved toward her, still shooting. Winter fired several more times, just to provoke them, and to make sure they remained within the chamber. One of her shots ricocheted off a gleaming surface and flew into the side of a stormtrooper, melting the white armor from his right arm. Winter appeared to be cornered at the far side of the room as the troopers advanced toward her, 5 of them, one hanging back with an injured arm. The Imperial soldiers got halfway across the space before the walls began to writhe and move. Jointed pipelines and conduits, bulky control decks, and spherical readout panels shifted, clicking together into specific components. Winter heard pieces locking into place, metal against metal, connections linking up. The machine-filled walls suddenly became a squad of burly assassin droids assembled out of disguised components. The droids activated their weapons, forming a shooting gallery whose only purpose was to destroy stormtroopers. Winter had no need to issue commands. The assassin droids knew exactly what they were supposed to do. They had been programmed to ignore her and the Jedi children, but they knew their targets well. From all sides, the assassin droids opened fire on the 5 pursuers. The crossfired, deadly beams cut down the white-armored Imperials in less than 2 seconds, leaving only piles of smoldering wreckage, fused and melted armor, and useless weapons in dead hands. None of the stormtroopers had an opportunity to fire a single shot. One of the troopers groaned once, hissed in pain, then fell into the silence of death. The shadows cast a blanket over the carnage. Heaving a sigh of relief, Winter stepped over the bodies, which were still sizzling from the massacre. She looked down at the expressionless black visors of the Imperial enemy. "Never underestimate your opponent," she said. Ambassador Fergan crouched low as the stormtrooper sprinted ahead of him down the lumpy rock corridors. Fergan had no combat training and no experience, but he did his best to imitate his companion's fluid movements. He held his blaster rifle in hand, glancing down repeatedly to make sure the weapon was powered up. The tunnels were dim and shadowy, lit by white glow tubes mounted along the ceilings. The stormtrooper pressed his armor back against the wall and held his weapon around a corner to see if he drew any fire. Then he jogged down to the next intersection of tunnels. They passed door after door, unsealing each room, ready to snatch the helpless child and run back to their empty ATs. Fergan and the trooper found storage compartments filled with crates of supplies and equipment, the dining room, empty sleeping quarters, but no child. Far beneath them, Fergan heard the patter and distant echo of blaster fire. He glared back toward the sounds. "I told them not to shoot her down. Why didn't they listen to me?" He turned to the stormtrooper. "Now we'll have to find the child all by ourselves." "Yes, sir," the stormtrooper said without expression. The next metal door was locked and sealed. No one responded when the stormtrooper hammered with his white gauntlet. He withdrew a pack of tools from his utility belt, removed a high-powered cutting laser, and slashed open the door's control panel. Moving with nimble fingers despite the thick gloves, he rewired the sparking controls. The door ground open, exposing the pastel colors of a room filled with toys, a plush bed, and a 4-armed nanny droid backed into a protective position in the corner to shelter a small child. "Ah, here we are at last," Fergan said. He stepped inside, looking around for booby traps. The trooper flanked him, maintaining his defensive position, blaster rifle in hand. Fergan saw no other defenses, just the TDL droid. "Please leave," the nanny droid said in a sweet, grandmotherly voice. "You are disturbing the baby." Fergan let loose with a full-throated laugh. The only defense they managed was one nanny droid. He chuckled again. "We sent an entire assault team to take the baby away from a nanny droid." The TDL droid stood in front of the baby, who sat very still on the floor. The droid used her lower set of arms to unfold the blaster-proof metal apron from the base of her torso to shield the baby from stray laser fire. "You may not have this child," the droid said. "I must warn you that my programming is to protect him at all costs." "How touching. Well, I'm going to take that child, at all costs," Fergan said, nodding with a triumphant smile to the stormtrooper. "Go take the baby." The stormtrooper took one step forward. The droid held out all 4 arms in an imperative gesture to stop. "I'm sorry, but I cannot allow that," the nanny droid said calmly. "Close your eyes, baby Anakin." "What are you waiting for?" Fergan snapped at the trooper. "It's only a nanny droid." With a whir and a click, all 4 of the droid's hands detached and dropped to the floor, exposing the blaster barrels hidden in each of her wrists. "I am an enhanced nanny droid," she said with prim emphasis, "and you will not harm this child." She let loose with all 4 barrels, firing gouts of deadly energy. The 4 beams struck the approaching stormtrooper before he could swing up his blaster rifle. He was hurled back against the wall, shards of white armor flying away from smoking black wounds. Fergan yelled in astonishment and terror. He swung up his blaster rifle and depressed the firing button long before he took time to aim. A flurry of incandescent bolts sprayed across the room, reflecting from the pastel walls, bouncing off the corners. Fergan ducked but continued to fire. The nanny droid centered all 4 blaster arms on him, but Fergan raked his stream of blaster bolts across her rounded head and soft flesh-encased torso, succeeding more through luck than skill. Sparks flew and molten metal showered in all directions. Beneath the blaster-proof apron, the baby began to wail. Bruise-colored lips curved upward in a smile. Fergan stepped over the debris of the nanny droid and the dead stormtrooper to retrieve the child. He reached down to grab one of little Anakin's arms and yanked him into the air by the cloth of his pajamas. Fergan wasn't quite sure how to hold a baby, especially one that continued to squirm as this one did. Come with me, little one, he said. You are about to begin a whole new life of galactic importance. "21. Han Solo longed to get closer to Kip Duran in the council chambers on Coruscant, wanting to comfort his young friend, but the armed New Republic guards surrounding Kip made it impossible for anyone to approach. Kip moved slowly, as if walking barefoot across shattered glass. His eyes were dull, his face was seamed with new lines, as if the dark spirit of Exar Kun had shed his 4,000 years of existence onto Kip's shoulders. The Sun Crusher had once again been impounded by New Republic security, and Mon Mothma had declared the entire area off limits. There would be no further research into the workings of the superweapon. Kip's chaotic vengeance had demonstrated how horrible the Sun Crusher truly was. Inside the council chambers the air smelled thick and oppressive from too much tension and too little ventilation. The stone added a musty old smell to the room. The place made Han uneasy and claustrophobic. The council members wore their formal uniforms like armor, frowning like ancient sentinels, passing judgment. Some looked as if they hadn't had any rest. Han felt deeply troubled to be facing them without Leia. She had departed from Yavin 4 with Turpin, supposedly to go see Akbar, but he had not been able to learn what had happened to her. Leia certainly knew how to take care of herself, though, and he did not dare leave Kip alone with the predators here. Mon Mothma, flanked by her ever-present medical droids, seemed only partially aware of what was going on. None of the other council members had suggested removing her from office, while she was still willing to attend meetings, though Mon Mothma contributed little. Han was stunned by how much the chief of state had worsened in just the last few days. One of the functionaries beside the sculpted door arch tapped on a long chime, sending a pure tone into the air to call the attendees to order. Han didn't know much about the protocol of government, but he didn't plan to stand by and do nothing while Kip was trounced by bureaucratic bigwigs. Before one of the members could speak, Han stepped forward. "Hey, could you let me put in a word for my friend Kip Duran?" Aging General Jan Dodonna hauled himself to his feet. Ancient and weathered like a piece of gnarled driftwood, the bearded general still seemed filled with energy. His eyes flashed at Han. "The prisoner may speak for himself, General Solo. He has certainly shown no reluctance to act for himself. Let him answer our questions now." Chastised, Han stepped back and looked at the floor, tracing patterns made by cracks in the inset flagstones. Since Dodonna had the lectern, he leaned forward to look down at Kip. The young man lifted his tousled head and blinked sheepishly at the old tactician. "Kip Duran," Dodonna said, "you stole the Sun Crusher. You attacked and temporarily incapacitated the Jedi Master Luke Skywalker. You blew up the Cauldron Nebula and obliterated 2 other inhabited star systems. I will not debate the tactical significance of your actions, but we cannot tolerate juggernauts who make up their own orders and cause wholesale destruction on a whim." The other council members agreed. General Riken's deep, thick voice reverberated through the chamber. "This council had already decided that the Sun Crusher would never be used. We disposed of it in a safe and protected place, but you knowingly thwarted our wishes." The other members fell silent after Riken's words. They seemed eager to add their own condemnations, but realized there'd be little point in it. After a moment of silence, Kip spoke. His voice sounded impossibly thin and small, reminding Han and everyone else there just how young this boy was. "I have no excuse for my actions. I'll accept the consequences." "Even if your actions demand the death penalty?" the obese Senator Reckenthorm asked. "Such destruction as you have caused can warrant nothing less than execution." "Wait a minute," Han said. The council members glared at him, but he ignored their silent rebukes. I know, but listen to me for a minute. Kip wasn't himself. He was possessed by the evil spirit of a Sith Lord who has since been defeated. And he did do some good. He destroyed Dalla's fleet. How many lives did he save by doing that? We were at war, after all." Mon Mothma's words wheezed from her cracked lips. Her voice came out in a ragged whisper. The rest of the chamber fell into a deep hush as she began to talk. "Kip Duran," she said, "you have the blood of millions, perhaps billions, on your hands. We are a governing body here, not a judicial council. We have no right to decide your fate. You—" she gasped as if using most of her energy just to fill her lungs. "You must be judged by the Jedi Master. We are not qualified to judge your crimes." She raised one of her hands to gesture toward Han. Take him to Yavin. Let Master Skywalker decide his fate. 22. Leia, Akbar, and Turpin joined the rescue party from the Galactic Voyager, swooping through the violet skies of Anoth. Akbar took the lead in his own B-Wing. His weapon systems were powered up and ready to attack any ground assault team the Dreadnought had deployed. The starfighters soared over the fanged landscape toward the stone turret that Akbar and Luke had chosen for the base. Leia saw signs of damage that made her blood run cold, smoke and debris from an attack. "We're too late," she whispered. Part of the spire had been blasted away, and soot splattered the eroded surface. Below, she saw the still smoldering remains of several horrific mechanical spiders. Akbar's voice came over the ship-to-ship intercom. "Winter must be putting up a good fight. Our in-place defensive systems are functioning as planned." Leia swallowed to clear her dry throat. "Let's just hope that's good enough, Admiral." The fighters targeted in on where the blast doors had been melted aside. One of the heavy metal shields still hung in place in its tracks. The rescue ships maneuvered around the 4 walkers that cluttered the floor of the landing bay. Akbar, Leia, and Turpin sprang out of their cockpits as other Calamarian fighters joined them. "Turpin, go with Minister Leia and half the fighters directly to the nursery. See if the baby is still there. I will take the other troops down into the lower levels to find Winter. I think I know what her strategy would have been." Leia, not bothering to argue, yanked out her own blaster pistol. With a hardened expression, she took the lead, running to see that her child was safe. The team swarmed down the maze of convoluted tunnels toward the nursery. Leia glanced around her as she jogged, but saw no signs of blaster fire on the walls. Weapons rattled against body armor as the Calamarians ran to keep pace with her. As they rounded the last corner toward Anakin's room, Leia swerved to keep from tripping over the slow-moving power droid who plodded along on its rounds, unconcerned with the turmoil. Leia paid the walking battery no further heed when she saw the door to the nursery yawning open. "Oh no," she said, lurching to a cautious stop just as Ambassador Fergan backed out, clutching a squalling Anakin to his broad chest. Both Leia and Fergan froze for a moment, staring at each other. Fergan's eyebrows jerked up in a muscular twitch like birds about to leap into flight. The Calamarian rescuers leveled their weapons at Fergan. He held the baby in front of him like a shield. "Give Anakin back to me," Leia said, her voice dripping with greater threat than an entire fleet of Star Destroyers could convey. "I'm afraid not," Fergan said, and wrapped a broad hand around Anakin's fragile neck. His wild eyes flicked from side to side. "Point your guns away from me, or I'll snap his neck. I've gone through all this to get the Jedi baby, and I'm not going to give him up. He's my hostage, and the only way he stays alive is for you to let me go." He edged along the tunnel. His back scraped against the rough, lumpy wall. Fergan locked his eyes on the weapons pointed at him, but he held the baby out, squeezing the boy's throat. "Even if you stun me, I can still crush his windpipe. Drop your weapons." "Back off," Leia ordered, taking a step backward. The Calamarian defenders stepped to the side, clearing a path for Fergan, all except for Turpin. He stood holding his hands in front of him like sharp claws. Fergan saw the swollen, sagging Calamarian head, the tracery of blunt scars, and suddenly recognized him. "So, my little fish, you betrayed me after all. I didn't think you had the strength of will." "I found the strength," Turpin said. He stepped toward Fergan. Anakin continued to squirm in the ambassador's arms. "Stop," Fergan said. "You have enough on your conscience, little fish. You wouldn't want to add the death of this baby to it." Turpin made a low, gurgling noise that was some kind of Calamarian snarl. Fergan kept his wild gaze fixed on all those cornering him as he slid backward toward the spider walkers and his only escape. In his grasp, baby Anakin's deep brown eyes flashed, as if he were deep in thought. Suddenly, Fergan cried out as he stumbled against the squarish, waddling power droid that had silently crept up behind him. The power droid gave out a small jolt of electricity, shocking Fergan. The ambassador tripped and fell, still holding the child. The power droid shuffled out of the way with a squeal of something like terror. As the Calamarian defenders snatched up their weapons again, Turpin lunged forward to grab the baby out of Fergan's hands. The other Calamarians fired at Fergan, but the squat man rolled across the floor, got to his knees, and launched himself around the corner, moving far faster than Leia would have ever thought possible. "After him!" Turpin cried. He passed baby Anakin to Leia and dashed off in pursuit of Fergan. As hot tears flowed from her eyes, Leia hugged her youngest son, trying to find words that would counsel him, but nothing came to mind, so she just made cooing noises. She sank to the floor, rocking him back and forth. Akbar's broad feet slapped on the stone floor as he ran deeper into the catacombs. His lungs burned in the dry air, but still he insisted on more speed. He pulled ahead of the others. So far, Winter had followed exactly the guidelines he had established for defense of the base. He knew from the wreckage outside that the foreign intruder defense organism had done its job, eliminating half the spider walkers before they could breach the blast doors. But it had not been enough. Winter would have proceeded down to trigger the camouflaged assassin droids. The other team members clattered behind him. He could smell dust and engine oil in the dry air, and also a sharp, damp smell like copper and smoke. Blood. The robed form of Winter sprang around the corner, holding a blaster in front of her, ready to fire. But she froze. For just an instant, a smile of delight crossed her face. Akbar, I knew you would come. Akbar strode toward her, resting his hand on her arm. I arrived as fast as I could. You are safe? For the moment, she said. The defenses have eliminated all but 2 of the intruders, according to my inventory. Are you certain? He said. I never forget anything, Winter said, and Akbar knew it was true. Leia and the rest of my team should be getting Anakin now, he said, then continued softly. We split up so that I could determine if you required assistance. She nodded. The expression on her face softened. I will not feel comfortable until I see the baby safe. Let's go, Akbar said, still out of breath. Together they began the long run uphill. Turpin raced feverishly up sloping corridors. His feet were raw, bleeding from running on the textured floor, but still he ran. He didn't care if this race killed him. He had to get to Fergan before the ambassador escaped. Fergan had jerked his controls and made Turpin reveal damning secrets of the New Republic, forcing him to sabotage Akbar's B-Wing so that it crashed into the Cathedral of Winds, made him betray the location of the Jedi baby. Turpin would pay his personal debt in any way he could, but Fergan would also have to pay the price. With determination coursing through his veins, Turpin passed the other Calamarian pursuers. Through the dimness he could hear Fergan scurrying forward like a crabex. Follow! Turpin wheezed as he shot past the others. Turpin leaped over fallen hunks of metal shrapnel, blasted doors that the invading stormtroopers had blown away. He emerged into the landing grotto to find Fergan already scrambling into one of the unoccupied MT-ATs. You can't escape, Fergan, Turpin shouted. He paused to catch his breath against the melted but now cooled hatch. Fergan slung one leg over the edge of the spider walker and settled himself into its cockpit. His face wrinkled as if someone had scrunched it up from the inside. We already destroyed your dreadnought in orbit, Turpin said. Finding energy deep within him, he staggered toward the walker. He heard the other troops catching up. Fergan looked amazed at the news, but then his face smoothed again with disbelief. I know better than to trust you, you little fish. Your whole life is a lie. Fergan closed the transparasteel canopy. The engines hummed to life. One of the other outer blast doors had been completely torn away. The other hung half open. Wind sighed through the opening. In the clouded purple sky, the 2 larger components of a Noth rode overhead like stone clouds exchanging lightning across the silence of space. Turpin snarled and ran to another spider walker. He was a chief starship mechanic. He had helped the Imperials work on their combat vehicles and their star destroyers. He could run any equipment, probably better than Fergan himself. In his panic, Fergan had trouble making all 8 of the walker's legs move in sequence to make progress across the grotto floor, but he finally plowed ahead, swiveling the laser cannons on the joints of the articulated legs to blast one of the B-Wing fighters that stood in the way. Turpin powered up his spider walker and slammed on the canopy. The machine had crude controls and sluggish response, nothing at all like the streamlined controls used on Mon Calamari star cruisers. Fergan's vehicle approached the large opening at the cliff's edge, and Turpin knew from the design of the MT-80 that it could climb straight down the rock face. He didn't quite know how Fergan could escape once he got to the bottom. He doubted the ambassador had thought that far ahead. Turpin found the fire controls and shot his lasers 3 times, taking out one joint of the other walker's legs. The lower portion of the metal limb sheared off and fell to the grotto floor with a clang. Off balance, Fergan's walker scuttled in a drunkard's circle until he managed to compensate for the lost limb. Once again, he made for the exit. Turpin saw the powerful blaster cannons slung beneath his cockpit. If he fired both of them in the enclosed grotto, it would obliterate Fergan's assault transport, but the explosion would also destroy him and his own walker, and probably most of the B-Wings as well. Then Turpin saw other rescuers streaming into the grotto. Admiral Akbar himself came from a different entrance and stood with his own team next to a white-clad woman whom he recognized as Leia's companion Winter. He could never fire the blaster cannons now, but he vowed not to let Fergan escape. Working the controls, Turpin lunged the 8-legged vehicle forward in pursuit just as Fergan's machine tottered on the edge. Akbar arrived in time to see the beginning of the battle between the two spider walkers. Turpin's lasers blasted out, striking the ambassador's MT-80. Fergan didn't seem to have a plan, intending only to get away. Turpin's walker scuttled forward. Its clawed footpads struck sparks from the landing bay floor. Turpin blasted again and again with his lasers. Fergan fired back, but his shot missed, scoring sharp flakes of rock from the grotto wall. Turpin's MT-80 charged ahead, raising its two front clawed legs, and grabbed the metal limbs of Fergan's transport, raising it partway off the floor. Fergan's vehicle reached out with its own legs to grasp the edge of the cave opening, trying to haul itself forward and away. Turpin fired directly at the transparent steel canopy of the cockpit, but the laser shots could not pass through the shielded surface. His spider walker grappled with Fergan's vehicle, 4 mechanical legs planted firmly on the stone floor, 4 legs pushing with all his engine's capacity. A large chunk of rock shattered at the claw grip. With a horrible sound of rending, tearing metal, Fergan's walker finally broke free of the grotto opening. Turpin's MT-80 pushed forward and forward. Inside the cockpit of the ambassador's vehicle, Fergan frantically grabbed the controls but did not seem to know which to use. Turpin continued his relentless blasting with the lasers. He shoved Fergan's walker completely through where the blast door had been blown away and held out the thrashing MT-80 over open space. Turpin released his grip. Ambassador Fergan's multi-legged vehicle flailed as it dropped through the air on a huge plunge toward the jagged landscape far below. Before the assault vehicle could actually strike the ground, Turpin fired both of his powerful blaster cannons. The beams blew up Fergan's MT-80 with a blinding flash just above the spiked rocks. And then, inexplicably, Turpin's walker continued its own forward motion, moving mechanical legs to drive him over the edge in a suicidal plunge. Akbar instantly knew what Turpin intended. Not wasting time with a shout that could not be heard, he lunged for the blast door controls. Just as the thrashing metal legs vanished over the lip of the cliff, Akbar punched the buttons, hoping that the skewed half of the door still functioned just enough. The heavy metal plate crashed down on top of the last footpad of Turpin's spider walker, pinning it to the cliff and preventing it from falling. "Help him!" Akbar cried. The other Calamarians scrambled forward, accompanied by the Admiral himself. Secured with a tow cable from one of the B-Wings, they lowered themselves over the cliff to open the canopy of Turpin's walker. Inside, they found him shuddering and nearly unconscious with shock. The team rigged a sling and hauled him to the safety of the grotto. Akbar bent over him, looking stern. He called Turpin's name until the scarred Calamarian finally stirred. "You should have let me die," he said. "My death should have been my punishment." "No, Turpin," Akbar said. "We cannot choose our own punishment. There is still much you can contribute to the New Republic, still a great many things to do before you will be allowed to give up." Akbar straightened, realizing that those words could just as well apply to himself after he had run away to hide on the planet Calamari. "Your punishment, Turpin," he said, "will be to live." 23. The Falcon cruised over the lush treetops of Yavin 4, and Han Solo set the ship down in front of the Great Temple. He bounced on the landing ramp. Leia and the twins practically tackled him as they rushed to greet him. "Daddy! Daddy!" Jason and Jaina cried in peculiarly overlapping voices. Leia, back from Anoth, cradled the 1-year-old against her chest, squeezed Han and gave him a long kiss as Anakin played with her hair. The twins jumped up and down against Han's legs, demanding the attention that was their due. "Hello there, little guy," Han grinned, looking down at Anakin. Then he looked deep into Leia's eyes. "Are you all right? You got a lot of details to tell me. That message you sent wasn't very explicit." Yeah, she said. You'll get the whole story when we have some quiet time, just the two of us. I'm glad all of our children are home to stay, though. We'll protect them ourselves from now on. Sounds like a great idea to me, Han said, then chuckled and shook his head. Say, weren't you telling me that I shouldn't go off and have adventures by myself? Han stepped away from the Falcon as he saw Luke Skywalker striding toward him across the flattened landing grid. R2-D2 puttered along next to him as if reluctant ever to leave his master's side again. Luke! Han cried. He ran to give Luke an enthusiastic hug. Great to see you up and around again. About time you quit napping. Luke clapped him on the back and smiled with dark-ringed eyes that shone with an inner brightness stronger than ever before. As he conquered each seemingly insurmountable obstacle, Luke's Jedi powers grew greater and greater. But, like Obi-Wan Kenobi and Yoda, a Jedi Master learned to use his powers even less, relying on wits instead of showmanship. In the dense jungle surrounding the Massassi temple, a squawking racket boiled up as a gang of Woolmanders startled a pair of feathered flying creatures. The Woolmanders hurled rotten fruit as the flying creatures flapped into the air, shrieking down at their tormentors. Han glanced toward the disturbance, but Luke's gaze remained fixed on the Falcon, as if held by a powerful magnet. Han turned to look, and stopped. Kip Duron, still wrapped in the slick black cape that Han himself had given him, descended the boarding ramp. His eyes locked on Luke's, and the two Jedi stared at each other as if psychically linked. Han stepped away from Luke, and the Jedi teacher silently walked across the weed-strewn landing grid. Kip reached the end of the ramp, planted his feet on the soil of Yavin 4 again, and stood looking penitent. Han could tell from Kip's rigid posture and his set jaw that the young man was terrified at having to face his Jedi master. Han felt cold, not wanting to be trapped between two people he counted among his dearest friends. Leia took the children off to one side, watching the encounter warily. Concern furrowed her brow as she flicked her gaze from her brother to Kip and back again. Luke walked toward his student slowly, as if gliding over the ground. I knew you would come back, Kip. Han watched him, and it seemed that Luke had no anger in his bearing, no fury or need for vengeance. Exar Kun is destroyed? Kip asked hoarsely. But he knew the answer already. Exar Kun will have no influence on your future training, Kip. The question is, what will you do with your abilities? Kip blinked his eyes in shock. You would let me continue my training? Luke's expression softened further. I had to witness the death of my first teacher. I also had to confront Darth Vader, my own father. I have done other difficult tasks. I did not plan these things, but each time I passed through the fire of an ordeal such as those, I emerged a more powerful Jedi. You, Kip, have been thrown into the flames. I must determine whether you have been consumed, or tempered into a great Jedi. Can you forsake the dark side? Kip stumbled over his words. I will try. No! Luke shouted with the first glimmering of anger that Han had heard in his voice. There is no try. You must believe you will do it, or you will fail. The jungle fell silent. Kip hung his head, and his nostrils flared as he took a deep breath. The young man's dark eyes glittered as he looked back up into Luke's face. I want to be a Jedi, he said. 24. Lando Calrissian felt as if the million-credit reward was burning a hole in his account. He needed to invest it soon. It was a new feeling for him to have such a large sum of money and nothing practical to do with it. He had won control of Bespin's Tabana gas mines in a sabacc game, and he had served for years as Baron Administrator of Cloud City. He had run metal mining operations on the super-hot planet Niklon, and now with his huge reward from the blob races on Umgal, Lando saw no reason why he could not make a successful operation out of the spice mines at Kessel. I really appreciate your taking me, Han, Lando said. He reached over to slap his friend's shoulder in the cockpit of the Millennium Falcon. He knew that Han was not terribly pleased to leave Leia and his children again so soon, even if only for a day to drop them off at Kessel. He suspected, too, that Han was also worried about Chewbacca and the Maw occupation force, who had sent no word since advancing into the black hole cluster. Since the Maw lay near Kessel, Han probably hoped to learn some news. It'll be worth it, if only to keep you from begging for rides all the time, Han said, looking in the opposite direction. He glanced out the front viewport. I still think you're crazy to want to go to Kessel, even crazier to want to stay there. Ahead, the small planet orbited near its faint sun. The misshapen lump of Kessel had too little gravity to hold its own atmosphere, and so the gases streamed into space like a tenuous mane flowing out from its barren, rocky outline. A large moon, on which the alien prison lord, Maruth Duel, had stationed his garrison of pirates, climbed over the limb of Kessel, emerging from the wispy corona of escaping air. "Last time I came here with Chewie," Han said, shaking his head, "we got shot down. I promised myself I'd never come back. And now it's only been a couple of months and here I am again." "That's just because you're a good friend, Han. I really appreciate it. Mara Jade wouldn't want me to be late." Han smirked. "If she remembers to show up, you mean." Lando laced his fingers behind his neck, staring at the rising moon as the Falcon arrowed into a close orbit. "She'll be there," Lando said. "I bet she's been counting down the days." "Wish I had Chewie back as a co-pilot," Han muttered, rolling his eyes. "At least he didn't say hokey things." At the mention of Chewbacca, both men subconsciously looked toward the glowing tapestry of ragged gases surrounding the Maw cluster. Somewhere inside, Chewbacca and the rest of the strike force should be mopping up their efforts to retake the Maw installation. The black holes made communication impossible, so they had no way of knowing what had happened during the occupation. "I hope he's all right, Han," Lando said quietly. Han leaned forward to finger the controls of the comm unit. He hesitated, and his face sagged for an instant, but he flicked on the transmitter, cleared his throat, businesslike again. "This is Han Solo on the Millennium Falcon, approaching Kessel." Lando watched Han's left hand drift to the hyperspace controls. A new course had already been programmed into the nav computer. Han was ready to dash away at a moment's notice if anything suspicious happened. "We're looking for Mara Jade, a representative of the Smugglers Alliance," Han continued. "We, request permission to land on the Garrison Moon. Please acknowledge before we come any closer." Han's face was lined with concern. "Don't be so nervous, Han," Lando said. "Things have changed on Kessel. You'll see." Han's voice took on a defensive tone. "I just don't want to take any chances after what's already happened." Before Lando could respond, Mara Jade's crisp, businesslike voice came over the speaker. Lando felt his heart warm at hearing her subtle tones. He imagined her soft lips moving, forming the words. "You're half a day late, Solo," she said. "Well, Lando here wanted to make himself look presentable," Han said, grinning. "And you know how much time that could take." Mara gave a short, sharp laugh, and Lando glared at Han. "Come on in, then," she said. "I brought a defensive fleet from the Smugglers Alliance. The Garrison Moon is secure. We'll discuss our business there. I have an escort coming for you. Something I think Calrissian will appreciate." Lando smiled broadly. "She's planned some kind of surprise for me. Probably a token of her affection." "Oh, brother." Han rolled his eyes again. Han checked the coordinates on his navigation console and vectored in toward the large station on Kessel's moon. Disguised as potential investors in the spice mining operations, Lando Calrissian and Luke Skywalker had been shuttled up to this moon by frog-like Maruth Duel. Duel had done his best to show off the spice mining operations in hopes that Lando would sink his Blob 1 credits into the facility. With a shudder, Lando remembered how all the ships in the hangar bay had launched after them when he and Luke had stolen Han's repaired Falcon. The Kessel pirate fleet had run headlong into Admiral Dalos Star Destroyers as they charged out of the Maw cluster after Han Solo. The two fleets had crashed into each other, inflicting horrendous damage, but Han, Luke, and Lando had fled into hyperspace before seeing the outcome of the battle. Now a single small ship appeared over the misty horizon of Kessel. "This is Jade. I'm your escort. Follow me." The space yacht approached, then spun about to dart toward the moon. Han increased the Falcon's speed. Lando sat up sharply, his eyes blinking in astonishment. "Hey, that's my ship!" he cried. "That's the Lady Luck. That's—" "Well," Han said, "at least that saves us the trouble of looking for it." Lando grabbed the comm unit. "Mara, you found my ship. I can't thank you enough." He lowered his voice. "If there's anything I can do to repay you, anything in your wildest dreams." "Keep talking like that, Calrissian, and I might just send this ship on autopilot into the sun." Lando leaned back in the seat with a sigh and a smile. He flashed a glance at Han. "She's such a kidder." The space yacht Lady Luck looked sleek and angular with propulsion pods slung below. Her hull gleamed, none the worse for wear, somehow unscathed from the devastating battles on Kessel. Lando fidgeted, anxious to see Mara again, anxious to sit back in the plush cushions of his own pilot chair, to luxuriate in the smell and feel of his own ship. They entered the cave mouth of the moon garrison, flying past the thick blast doors into the garish light of the large landing bay. The atmosphere containment fields closed behind them and repressurized the habitable area. The Falcon coasted in on its repulsor lifts and landed in a broad, polished area beside the Lady Luck. Mara Jade swung out, clad in a tight metallic jumpsuit with a helmet tucked under her right elbow. As she tossed her head to loosen her dark, reddish-brown hair, she narrowed her eyes. Lando stared with a warm, cold shudder at the energy and intelligence that radiated from this woman. He marveled at her generous curves, her tough exterior. "Hey, Mara," Han said. "Where'd you find Lando's ship? We thought we were going to have to spend days combing the surface for it." "Right where Lando claims he landed it. Seems nobody had time to strip her down and remove the identification markings." Lando glanced around the garrison bay, but all the ships looked unfamiliar, custom designs, not the barely moving scrap heaps that had made up Duel's fleet. These were emblazoned with markings unique to each vessel, though each carried a crosshatch design on the wing. Mara noticed his inspection. "That's our new insignia for the Smugglers' Alliance," she said. "Not too obvious, but enough for us." "What happened to all Duel ships?" Lando sniffed the enclosed dry air, smelling the powdered rock and spilled hyperdrive fuel that made the air sour and unpleasant. 90% of Duel's ships were obliterated in their tangle with Dallas Star Destroyers. Most of the surviving pilots took their ships and fled into hyperspace. No one knows where they are now, and frankly, I don't care. When a few New Republic relief ships came in, they evacuated most of the inhabitants, prisoners in the Imperial Correction Facility, a few holdouts in the city of Cassandra. Nobody wants to make a life on Kessel if they have another option. "So what you're saying," Lando said, letting his hopes rise, "that Kessel is deserted, ready for the taking?" "Yes," Mara said. "I've talked over your proposal with some members of our alliance, and it sounds good to us. Not only have you proved your ability in your other ventures, but you've also got strong connections with the New Republic, which will allow efficient distribution channels for Glitterstim. You've even got enough money to invest in the new infrastructure." She shrugged. "Sounds like a good deal all around." Lando beamed. "I knew you'd realize that being partners with me is a very good deal." Mara turned abruptly and continued with her discussion, ignoring his insinuation. "But we need to move right away. We've heard talk of other less scrupulous crime lords arranging to take over the mines. The spice tunnels are empty, ripe for the plucking. Frankly, we'd rather deal with you, Calrissian, than someone who's going to bring in his own teams and cut the Smugglers' Alliance out of the entire operation. That's why we brought our forces here to hold it, just in case some Hutt crime lord gets any ideas." "Makes sense to me," Han said. Lando rubbed his hands together, looking at the other ships in the bay. Various smugglers moved around, humans and aliens, burly-looking men and women, people he wouldn't want to meet alone in the dim lower levels of Coruscant. "Should we go down and have a look at the real estate?" "Fine." Mara snapped to attention. "Let's go ahead and take your ship, Calrissian. You pilot her." Lando reveled in the feel of his controls again, running his hands along the soft, polished seats. This was his own space yacht, specially built to his own personal design. Now he was riding in the cockpit with a beautiful, intelligent woman, heading down to a planet where he intended to make a fortune. He didn't think the day could possibly get better. He was right. When they soared low over the parched and blasted surface of Kessel, they cruised past one of the major atmosphere factories, which had once spewed manufactured air to replenish the constant loss from the low gravity. But the tall stack stood half collapsed. Black blaster scorches mottled its pale exterior. The baked, dry ground, already lifeless except for a few tufts of extremely hardy vegetation, had been torn up by TIE bombers and space-based turbo-laser strikes. "Over half the atmosphere factories are out of commission," Mara explained. "Admiral Dalla did a lot of damage. Seems she thought this was a rebel base, so she struck at anything that showed up on her targeting screens." Lando had a sinking feeling deep in his chest. "This is going to take more work than I had anticipated," he said. But he consoled himself by calculating the unclaimed wealth within the tunnels below and thinking of how he could get teams of droids, Sulistans, and other races to work for shares in the profits. It might take a little longer to earn back his investment, but the demand for pure Glitterstim was so high that he could raise his prices, at least until he turned a profit. "I'm heading toward the prison," Lando said. "That fortress should have withstood the attack from space. I think I'll use that as my base of operations. It'll take some conversions, but we should be able to adapt it into the control center for our new manufacturing complex." The speed of the Lady Luck rapidly ate the kilometers across the empty landscape until a towering trapezoid stood like a great monument on the barren surface. The old imperial prison was made of synthetic rock, flat, unappealing tan veined with other colors. An outcropping of crystal windows jutted from the slanted smooth front. Tubed elevator shafts rode along the angled corners. The place was streaked with burn marks, but appeared undamaged. Lando heaved a sigh of relief. "At least the building looks intact," he said. "Something's going right for a change. This will be a great place to start." He smiled at Mara. "You and I should christen our new headquarters." Mara Jade frowned and kept looking out the front viewport. There is one problem, Calrissian." Lando and Han turned to look at her. The prison loomed higher as the Lady Luck continued to approach. Mara continued, "Well, you see, Maruth Duel has holed himself up inside the prison building. He's scared to death, doesn't know what to do. All his cohorts have fled or been killed, and now he's using the sophisticated prison defense system to keep everyone else out." The fortress looked impenetrable, a huge, hulking mass of stone armor. Lando had no desire whatsoever to see Maruth Duel again, and neither he knew did Han. "I wish you had mentioned that detail a little sooner," Lando said with a grimace, as he brought the Lady Luck in for a landing. 25. Inside the rigid cleanness of the medical chambers in the old imperial palace, Turpin stood silent and patient. He waited and watched the massaging bubbles in the Bacta tank working on Mon Mothma's ailing body. The medical chambers glowed with sterile whiteness. The tiles on the floor and walls had been acid scoured, utensils and surgical equipment gleamed silver and chrome. Wall monitors blinked with a steady, throbbing rhythm, proclaiming the declining state of Mon Mothma's health. Outside the chamber doors, 2 New Republic guards stood watch, making certain no one could intrude. Sound absorption panels in the ceiling deadened the mechanical whispers in the large chamber. 2 bullet-headed medical droids hovered on either side of the tank, tending Mon Mothma and paying no attention to Turpin. Beside him, Akbar stood tall and strong. "She'll be finished soon," he said. Turpin nodded, not eager to speak to Mon Mothma, but resigned to the necessity of it. In these chambers the Emperor had himself undergone rigorous treatments as dark-side workings rotted his physical body. Perhaps the same facilities could remove the scourge within Mon Mothma's body. Turpin had little hope of that now that he knew what had caused it. Mon Mothma blinked her greenish-blue eyes through the murk of the tank's solution. Turpin couldn't tell if she could focus on them standing outside, or if she merely sensed their presence. She moved her head, and the thick air hose drifted with her. Bubbles pummeled her body, forcing invigorating solutions through her pores. Mon Mothma released her grip on the stabilizers within the tank and floated up. The droids assisted her in getting out. She stood sagging, dripping as her lightweight robes dripped solution into drainage grates on the floor. Even the thin, wet robe seemed as heavy as a leaden shroud to her. Her auburn hair clung like a skull cap. Her eyes were sunken, her face chiseled with deep canyons of pain and weakness. She filled her lungs and exhaled, resting the flat of her hand against the medical droid's green shoulders. She raised her head with obvious effort and acknowledged her visitors. "The treatments give me strength for only about an hour. Their effectiveness decreases every day," she said. "Soon it will be useless, I'm afraid, and I will no longer be able to perform my functions as chief of state. The only question is whether I resign before the council removes me." She turned to Turpin. "Don't worry. I know why you are here." Turpin blinked his glassy eyes. "I don't believe—" She raised a hand to cut off his objections. "Akbar has spoken to me at great length. He has considered your case thoroughly, and I agree with his conclusions. You were not acting of your own free will, but were merely a victim. You have redeemed yourself. The New Republic can't afford to throw away defenders who are willing to continue the fight. I've already issued a full pardon for you." She wavered on the verge of slumping backward. The 2 medical droids moved to help her to a chair. "I wanted to make sure that got done before—" Akbar made a grumbling noise as he cleared his throat. "I am also here to tell you, Mon Mothma, that I have decided to stay. I will request that my rank be reinstated, now that it is clear the crash on Vortex was not solely due to my error as I had originally thought. The people of Calamari are resilient, and they are strong. But if the New Republic is not also strong, my work at home will be fruitless, because we will face a galaxy full of shadows and fear. Mon Mothma smiled at Akbar, a sincere expression of relief. Akbar, knowing that you will be here makes me feel stronger than any of these treatments ever did. Then she showed a deeper misery and let her chin sink into her hands, a moment of weakness she would never have displayed in front of the council. Why did this disease have to strike me now? I'm mortal just like everyone else. But why now? Turpin walked across the slippery floor, feeling the cold, polished surface on the soles of his broad feet. He bowed his scarred, traced head. At the doorway, the two New Republic guards stiffened at seeing the known traitor so close to their chief estate, but Mon Mothma showed no alarm. Turpin looked down at her. "That is what I have come to discuss with you, Mon Mothma. I must tell you what has happened to you." Mon Mothma blinked, waiting for him to continue. Turpin searched for the right words. His mind seemed so empty now that the implanted biological circuits had been neutralized. He had hated the insistent compulsions from Coradia, but now he was left alone with his own thoughts. No one else inside his skull to taunt him or to guide him. "You are suffering from no disease, Mon Mothma. You have been poisoned." She jerked in a sudden shock, but did not interrupt him. "It is a slow, debilitating poison targeted specifically to your genetic structure." "But how was I exposed to this poison?" She looked hard at him, not accusing, but insisting on answers. "Did you do it, Turpin? Was this another of your programmed actions?" "No!" He reeled backward. "I have done many things, but that is not one of them. You were poisoned by Ambassador Fergan himself, as dozens of people watched, during the diplomatic reception at the Sky Dome Botanical Gardens. Fergan carried his own refreshment because he claimed you might try to poison him. He had 2 flasks, one on each side of his hip. In one flask he carried his true beverage, in the other he carried a poison specifically developed for you. He pretended to propose a toast, and then tossed a glassful of the poison into your face. It seeped into your pores and has been multiplying and attacking your cells ever since." Both Akbar and Mon Mothma stared at him in astonishment. "Of course," she said. "But it's been months. Why did they choose such a slow acting?" Turpin closed his eyes, and the words came to him as if he were reciting a script. "They wanted a long, debilitating decline for you because of the damage it would do to the New Republic's morale. If you were simply killed, you could become a martyr. Your death might have galvanized support from otherwise neutral systems, but with a slow, progressive weakening, it could be seen as the decay of the rebellion." "I see," Mon Mothma said. "Very shrewd," Akbar said. "But what are we to do with this information? What else do you know of the poison, Turpin? How can we treat it?" Turpin heard the silence in his head like a scream. "This is not a true poison. It is a self-replicating swarm of nano-destroyers, microscopic, artificially created viruses dismantling Mon Mothma's cells one nucleus at a time. They will not stop until her life ceases." "Then what do we do?" Akbar persisted. Finally, the helplessness and all the pain within Turpin built until it spilled out of him like a star finally reaching its flashpoint. "We can do nothing," he shouted. "Even knowing about this poison does not help us, because there is no cure." 26. The battered Star Destroyer Gorgon barely survived its passage through the gravitational whirlpool into the Maw cluster. Admiral Dalla strapped herself to a command chair on the bridge as the Star Destroyer was buffeted by tidal forces that would rip the ship apart if their trajectory deviated from its charted path. Dalla had ordered her crew to stand down and take refuge in protective areas, to buckle themselves into their stations and prepare for a rough ride. Of the very few known paths inside the Maw cluster, she had chosen the shortest, the back door, but still her ship was in no shape to withstand the enormous stresses for long. Many of the Gorgon's stabilizers had blown in their narrow escape from the multiple supernova explosion in the Cauldron Nebula. Shields had failed at the end, but they had held long enough. The Gorgon's once ivory metallic hull was now streaked and scarred. Outer layers of armor had boiled away, but Dalla had taken a gamble. She had been lucky, fleeing from the exploding suns, while only seconds behind her the basilisk had vaporized in flame, disintegrated by the outrushing supernova shockwave. But Dalla had ordered the Gorgon to plunge blindly into hyperspace mere moments before the explosive front had reached her rear thrusters. The desperate leap knocked them headlong on a reckless course through the hazards of the universe. The Gorgon would have been obliterated if they had stumbled into an interdimensional path that passed through the core of his planet or star. But through some miracle of fate that had not happened. The Gorgon had emerged in an uninhabited void in the outer rim. Their shields had failed, life support systems partly burned out, and the hull had been breached in several areas that let the atmosphere squeal into the vacuum of space until those compartments were sealed off. Collectively gasping from their narrow escape, Dalla's crew had set about effecting repairs. It took her navigators a day just to determine their galactic position because they had gone so far afield. Armored space troopers in totally contained environment suits walked over the external skeleton of the Gorgon, removing ruined components, patching weak spots in the hull, rigging emplacements from their meager inventory of spare parts. The Star Destroyer had drifted in the uninhabited space between stars. One of the engines was permanently damaged, and 3 of the aft turbolaser batteries were dead. But Dalla had let none of her crew rest until the Gorgon was functional again. They had a mission to complete. She did not allow herself the luxury of rest either, tirelessly marching down corridors, inspecting repairs, making personnel assignments, prioritizing maintenance tasks. Dalla had done well for more than 10 years, drilling her stormtroopers and her Space Navy personnel. They were used to grueling labor, and they performed admirably now that they were faced with a true crisis. Grand Moff Tarkin had given her command of 4 Star Destroyers to protect Maw Installation, but her first ship, the Hydra, had been lost even before she could bring her fleet out of the Maw cluster. The Manticore had been destroyed behind the moon of Calamari, unable to run when some Calamarian tactical genius had second-guessed Dalla's strategy. Her third ship, the Basilisk, already injured in the battle against smuggler forces at Kessel, had not been able to flee the supernova explosions fast enough. Dalla had been helpless to stop the attrition of her forces. She had planned a fabulous and devastating attack on the rebel capital world of Coruscant, but before she could strike, Kip Duran had used the Sun Crusher against her. During the long days of repairs, Dalla had come to terms with her failure. She had misplaced her priorities. Her only reason for existence should have been to protect Maw Installation, not to wage a private war against the rebellion. Once the rebels knew the installation, they would no doubt attempt to steal its secrets. Her priority now was to fulfill the mission that Tarkin had given her. The Gorgon was wounded, unable to proceed at full thrust, but still Dalla approached the Maw with all possible speed. She would return to the installation and protect what remained of it to the best of her ability. There would be no such thing as surrender. She had a job to do, a duty she had sworn to her superior officer Tarkin. Now Admiral Dalla clung to her command chair and kept her eyes open against the blazing swirls from the inferno of trapped gases. The Gorgon plunged through the barrier of black holes and followed a convoluted path. Dalla felt her insides tugged as she passed gravity wells so deep they could crush an entire planet to the size of an atom. The window ports dimmed, but still Dalla did not close her emerald eyes. Presumably only she knew the detailed route, but young Kip Duran had found his way, and she assumed that other Jedi Knights could perform the same feat. Dalla heard a system squeal with automatic alarms as some critical component failed. Sparks shot out of one of the sensor stations, and a lieutenant strained against the pull of acceleration to bypass the systems. In his seat, Commander Kratos spoke through clenched teeth. "Almost there," he said, his voice barely audible above the racket. A series of automatic warning signals echoed through the bridge, and suddenly the colors washed away from the front viewport like a blindfold being ripped from her eyes. The Star Destroyer had stumbled into the shielded comm at the center of the cluster. She recognized the isolated clump of interconnected planetoids gathered in a loose configuration. Glittering lights showed that the facility still functioned. In a rapid assessment, she saw that the framework of the Death Star prototype was gone, and in its place she saw a rebel frigate and 3 Corellian corvettes. "Admiral," Kratos said. "I see, Commander," she answered in a clipped voice. She unbuckled her restraints and stood up, automatically smoothing down the olive-gray uniform that clung to her trim body. Sweat prickled like tiny insect stings on her skin as she stepped onto the command platform and walked closer to the viewport as if responding to a summons. Her gloved hands gripped the bridge railing as if to strangle something. Black leather creaked against enameled metal. The rebels had come, just as she had feared, and Dalla had arrived too late to stop the invasion. Her lips grew white as she pressed them together. She believed the Gorgon had survived for a purpose, and now, as she returned to Maw Installation, it seemed as if the spirit of Grand Moff Tarkin were looking over her shoulder, guiding her. She knew what she was destined to do. She could not fail a second time. "Commander, power up all functional weapon systems," Dalla said. "Shields up, approach the installation." She looked back at large-browed, weak-chinned Commander Kratos, who snapped to attention. "It appears we have some work to do," Dalla said. 27. Kip Duron ducked under a thorny vine as a flock of scarlet insect birds thrummed into the air. Acrid stinging thistles brushed against his arm, his face. Overhead, the interlocked branches rustled as arboreal creatures fled from the noise. Sweat dripped from Kip's dark hair, and the oppressive air felt like a moist blanket, smothering him. He did his best to keep up with Master Skywalker, who flowed through the jungle thickets, finding secret paths that allowed him to pass unhindered. Kip had once used dark tricks to dodge spiny debris and find the easiest routes through the underbrush. Now, though, even the thought of such techniques made him shudder with revulsion. Once, when he had gone on a jungle sojourn with Dorsk 81, Kip had brashly used a Sith technique to generate an unappetizing aura around himself, driving away gnats and blood-sucking pests. Now, though, Kip tolerated the misery as Master Skywalker led him far from the great temple. They had left the other Jedi trainees to continue their independent studies. Master Skywalker was proud of them. He said that the trainees were reaching the limits of the techniques he himself could teach them. The new Jedi Knights would grow in their own directions, discover their own greatest strengths. But since the time he had come within a razor's edge of blasting Han Solo with the Sun Crusher, Kip had been reluctant to use his power, afraid of what it might drive him to do. Master Skywalker took Kip alone out into the jungles, leaving the Great Pyramid behind as R2-D2 wobbled and jittered, bleeping with displeasure at being left behind. Kip wasn't sure what the Jedi teacher wanted from him. Master Skywalker said little as they trudged for hour after hour through the dripping rainforest and the oppressive humidity, the insect-laden air, the claw-thorns of brambles. Kip was intimidated to be alone with the man he had defeated through Exar Kun's evil powers. Master Skywalker had insisted that Kip arm himself, that he wear the lightsaber built by Gantoris. Did Luke intend to challenge Kip to a duel? A duel to the death this time? If so, then Kip vowed not to fight. He had allowed his anger to cause too much destruction already. It was only by a miracle that Master Skywalker had survived the onslaught of Sith treachery. Kip had recognized the dark side when Exar Kun whispered in his ear, but he had been too overconfident, thinking he could resist where even Anakin Skywalker failed. But the dark side had swallowed him whole, and now Kip questioned all of his abilities and wished he could just be free of his Jedi talent so he need not fear what he might do with it. At the edge of a clearing with tall grasses stroking against each other, Master Skywalker came to a halt. Kip stopped beside him to see two ferocious-looking predators, iridescent in scales of pale purple and mottled green for camouflage in the thick vegetation. They looked like hunting cats crossbred with large reptiles. Their shoulders were square, their forearms as powerful as heavy pistons. They had 3 eyes across their boxy faces, yellow and slitted, unblinking as they stared at the intruders. Master Skywalker gazed back at them in silence. The breeze stopped. The predators growled, opening their mouths to expose scimitar fangs, and let out a purring howl before they melted back into the jungle. "Let's continue," Master Skywalker said, and walked across the clearing. "But where are we going?" Kip asked. "You'll see soon enough." Unable to bear his feelings of isolation and loneliness, Kip tried to keep the Jedi teacher talking. "Master Skywalker, what if I fail to distinguish between the dark side and the light side? I'm afraid that any power I use now might also lead me down the path of destruction." A feathery winged moth flitted in front of them, seeking nectar from the bright flowers that blossomed among the creeping vines. Kip watched the moth's flight until suddenly, from 4 different directions, sapphire-winged piranha beetles zoomed in to strike, ripping the moth's wings to shreds. The moth fluttered and struggled, but the piranha beetles devoured it before it could even fall to the ground. The beetles buzzed so close to Kip's face that he could see their saw-toothed mandibles ready to tear flesh to shreds, but the beetles ratcheted away to seek other prey. The dark side is easier, faster, more seductive, Luke said, but you can identify it by your emotions. If you use it for enlightenment to help others, it may be from the light side, but if you use it for your own advancement out of anger or revenge, then the power is tainted. Don't use it. You will know when you are calm, passive. Kip listened and knew that he had done everything wrong. Exar Kun had given him false information. The Jedi Master turned to him, his face looking haggard with the weight on his shoulders. "Do you understand?" Master Skywalker asked. "Yes," Kip answered. "Good." Master Skywalker parted the branches on the other side of the clearing to expose a sight that made Kip stop cold in his tracks. They had come from a different direction, but Kip could never forget the sight itself. Fragments of burning ice trickled down his spine. "I feel cold," he said. "I don't want to go back there." They stepped out to where the vegetation dropped off at the edge of a glassy, smooth lake, a circular reflecting pond where the water looked clear and colorless and reflected the cloudless skies above like a pool of quicksilver. In the center of the pond sat an island of volcanic rock, on which perched a sharply angled split pyramid made of obsidian. Two halves of the steep pyramid had been spread apart to bracket the polished black statue, a towering colossus of a man with flowing hair, bulky uniform, and long black cape. Kip knew the image all too well. Exar Kun in life. Inside that temple, Kip had received his initiation into the Sith teachings, while Dorsk 81 had lain in an unnatural coma against the wall. The spirit of Exar Kun had meant to destroy the clone Jedi student on a whim, as a gesture of power, but Kip had stopped him, insisting instead that the Sith Lord teach him everything. He had seen things that still left yammering nightmares in the depths of his mind. "The dark side is strong in that place," Kip said. "I can't go in there." Master Skywalker said, "In your fear lies caution, and in that caution lies wisdom and strength." He squatted on a comfortable rock at the edge of the crystalline lake. He shaded his eyes against the light reflecting from the surface of the pool. "I will wait here," Master Skywalker said, "but you must go inside." Kip swallowed, terror and revulsion rising within him. This black temple symbolized everything that had rotted his core, everything that had led him astray, all the mistakes he had made. The dark lies and goading of Exar Kun had caused Kip to kill his own brother, to threaten the life of his friend Han Solo, to strike down his Jedi teacher. Another shiver passed through him. Perhaps this was his punishment. "What will I find in there?" Kip asked. "Ask no more questions," Master Skywalker said. "I can give you no answers. You must choose whether to carry your weapon with you." He nodded toward the lightsaber handle clipped to Kip's waist. "You will have only what you bring with you." Kip touched the rigid handle of his lightsaber, afraid to turn it on. Did Master Skywalker want him to leave it behind or take it? Kip hesitated. Better to have the weapon and not use it, he decided, than to need it and be without. Trembling, Kip went to the water's edge. He looked down and observed the tall columns of stone that stopped just beneath the surface of the water, providing submerged stepping stones. Tentatively, he set one foot on the first stone. The water rippled around his foot. He drew a deep breath, raised his head high, and fought back the echoing voices in his head. He had to face this, whatever it was. He did not look back at Master Skywalker. He crossed the water and climbed onto the lichen-encrusted lava rocks of the island, walking the narrow path that led to the triangular entrance of the temple. Beneath the towering statue of Exar Kun, the black opening glittered with implanted Corsica gems. Incised runes and hieroglyphics broke the polished brightness of the obsidian. Kip stared at the writings, finding that he could summon some of their meaning back to him, but he shook his head to clear the words from his thoughts. The temple seemed to breathe a cool air current that seeped in and out of the enclosed space. Kip did not know what he would find inside. His body stiffened with anticipation. He looked around, refusing to call out. Kip took one step into the doorway and looked up at the dour, chiseled face of the long-dead Sith Lord. Then he entered the temple chamber. The walls glittered with an inner light that had been trapped within the volcanic glass. Tracings of frost spiraled in a frozen dance up and down the walls. In the far corner, a cistern dripped, filled with chilled water. He waited. Suddenly, Kip's stomach wrenched. His skin crawled. He blinked as his vision blurred. The air around him grew grainy, as if the light itself had splintered inside the temple. He tried to return, but found himself moving sluggishly as if the air resisted him, solidifying around him. Everything flickered. Kip staggered deeper into the temple, trying to move quickly, but his body would not respond with its customary speed. A shadow rose from the black wall, an ominous form, human-shaped. It gained power, growing as Kip fed it with his fear. The figure rose higher, oozing out of the cracks, out of a blackness from beyond time. A featureless silhouette that nevertheless seemed familiar to Kip. "You're dead," Kip said, attempting to sound angry and defiant, but his voice was uncertain. "Yes," the oddly familiar voice spoke from within the shadows. "But I still live within you. Only you, Kip, can make my memory strong." "No, I'll destroy you," Kip said. In his hand he felt the black power crackling, the ebony lightning he had used to strike Master Skywalker, the power of fanged serpents, the dark teachings of the Sith. How ironic it would be to use Exar Kun's own power against him. The energy grew stronger, begging to be unleashed, demanding that he give himself over to it so he could eradicate the black shadow for all time. But Kip forced himself to stop. He felt his heart pounding, his blood singing in his ears, his anger taking control, and he knew that was wrong. He took deep breaths. He calmed himself. This was not the way. The black Sith power faded from his fingertips. The shadow waited, but still Kip forced his power back, smothered his anger. Anger was exactly what Exar Kun would want. Kip could not give in to it now. Instead, he reached for the lightsaber at his hip, pulled it free, and flicked on the power button. The violet-white blade shone in an arc of cleansing electricity, purest light. The shadow hovered, as if waiting to do battle with him, waiting for Kip to make the first move. It lifted its nebulous arms, blacker than anything Kip had seen before. Kip raised Gantoris' lightsaber to strike, proud of what he was about to do. He would use a Jedi weapon instead, a weapon of light to strike the darkness. He made ready to swing. The shadow hung poised, as if stunned, and Kip halted again. He could not strike out, not even with a lightsaber. If he attacked Exar Kun, he would still succumb to the temptation and ease of violence, regardless of the weapon he chose. The lightsaber handle felt cold in his grip, but Kip switched the power off and clipped the handle to his belt. He stood alone, face to face with a shadow that now seemed his own size, merely the black outline of a human wearing a shroud. "I will not fight you," Kip said. "I am glad," said the voice, which became clearer now, more maddeningly familiar. Not Exar Kun at all. It never had been. The shadowy arms reached up to pull back the cowl, exposing an luminous face that clearly belonged to Kip's brother Zeth. "I am dead," the image of Zeth said, "but only you can keep my memory strong. Thank you for freeing me, brother." The image of Zeth embraced Kip with a brief, tingling rustle of warmth that melted the ice in Kip's spine. Then the spirit vanished, and Kip found himself alone again in a musty, empty temple that no longer held any power over him. Kip stepped into the warm sunlight again, free of the shadows. On the opposite shore he saw Master Skywalker stand up and look at him. Luke's face wore a broad grin, and he opened his arms in a celebratory gesture. "Come back and join us, Kip," Master Skywalker called. His voice echoed across the flat surface of the still water. "Welcome home, Jedi Knight." 28. The immense barricade doors of the Imperial Correction Facility did not budge, nor did they open when Han knocked. Naturally. He stood with Lando and Mara Jade outside on the scoured landscape of Kessel, dressed in an insulated jumpsuit taken from the Lady Luck stores. Mara leaned closer to Han, her shout muffled through the breath mask covering her mouth. "We could bring down a full-scale assault team from the moon," she said. "We have enough firepower." "No!" Lando shouted. His dark eyes shone with excitement and anxiety. "There must be a way to get in without damaging my facility." The cold, dry wind stung Han's eyes, and he turned his head to protect them from the breeze. He remembered gasping for air when Skyninx, Morris Duel's henchman, had dragged him and Chewbacca into the spice mines without giving them breathing apparatus. Right now, Han wanted nothing more than to kick the toad-legged Duel out of the prison so that his frog eyes could blink and his fat lips pump together as he tried to fill his lungs. Duel, an administrator of the correction facility, had dealt in black market glitterstim, making deals with Han and other smugglers to deliver the precious cargo to gangsters such as Jabba the Hutt. But Duel had a habit of delivering his partners into Imperial hands whenever it proved convenient. Duel had ratted on Han long ago, forcing him to dump his cargo, which had made Jabba very angry. Han did not want to be back on Kessel. He wanted to be back home with his wife and children. He wanted to have his companion Chewbacca back. He wanted to take a nice, relaxing vacation. For once. "I've got a better idea," Mara said, interrupting Han's thoughts. She craned her neck to look up at the murky sky. "Up on the Garrison Moon I brought along Ghent, our slicer. You might remember him. He used to be one of Talon Card's top aides. He can crack into anything." Han remembered the brash young slicer, an enthusiastic kid who knew electronics and computer systems intimately, but didn't know when to keep his mouth shut. Han shrugged. They didn't need social skills now. They needed someone who could crack through the defenses. "Okay, bring him down along with the Falcon," Han said. "I got a few gadgets inside my ship that might help us out, too. The sooner we can get in, the sooner I can get going." Lando agreed. "Yes, any way to enter without doing too much damage." Mara pursed her lips. "I'm also going to bring in a team of fighters. I've got 4 Mistral guards and a handful of other smugglers who are getting fidgety with our new alliance. Some of them have been complaining that it's been too long since they had a good, satisfying fist fight." An hour later, cold and uncomfortable even in the insulated suit, Han sat on the Lady Luck's thruster pod. He saw the faltering plumes from 2 distant atmosphere factory stacks, but the rest of the world stood lifeless. He knew from experience, though, that deep within the spice mines lurked hideous energy spiders, waiting to strike any creature they found. Han heard a sonic boom reverberate through the thin atmosphere, a high-pitched sound mixed with the thunder of sublight engines. He scanned the sky until he saw the prolonged disk of the Millennium Falcon. The ship landed in a powdery white clearing beside the Lady Luck. The ramp slid out, and 5 smugglers emerged. 2 tall, well-muscled women, Mistral guards, a hairy, tusk-faced Whipped, and a reptilian Trandoshan. Each wore a uniform with the crosshatch insignia of the new Smugglers' Alliance. The smugglers bristled with weapons. Their bulging belts contained enough recharge packs for an entire assault. Last on the ramp, still fumbling to adjust a breath mask over his face, came Ghent the Slicer, with tousled hair and rapidly blinking alert eyes. He nodded cursorily at Mara, then fixed his entire attention on the barricade gates. Slung over his shoulder was a satchel crammed with tools, diagnostic apparatus, splitters, rerouting circuits, and security cracking equipment. "Should be a piece of cake," Ghent said. Mara Jade and Lando sat next to Han and watched Ghent fall to work with total concentration, not the least distracted by the miserable environment of Kessel. Han said, "I certainly never dreamed I'd be trying so hard to break into the Kessel prison." Cowering behind a locked door in the lower levels of the Imperial Correction Facility, Maruth Duel longed for the good old days. Compared to the constant paranoia he had endured for the past several months, even life under the Imperial yoke had been paradise. After he had taken over the prison years ago, Duel had moved into the warden's office, where he could spend much time staring out at the landscape, observing the desolate purity of the alkali wastelands. He had fed upon tender, flying insects. Whenever the whim struck him, he had mated with one of his captive female rybettes in his personal harem. Now, though, since Dala's attack, he had moved into one of the high-security prison cells for protection. He had tried to make preparations, establish defenses, because he knew someone was going to come after him, sooner or later. The cell walls were thick and blast-proof. The light shone down, burning shapes into his blurry vision. He tapped the mechanical eye that helped him to focus. The device had broken during the space battle around Kessel. Duel had tinkered with the mechanical components, putting its gears and lenses back together. It no longer worked quite properly, though, and his vision winked out from time to time. Duel paced the cold, stone floor of his cell. Everything had fallen apart. The planet Kessel had been abandoned, leaving only smoking rubble on the surface and destroyed hulks of ships strewn across the system all the way to the black hole cluster. Duel couldn't even get a ship of his own to escape. He didn't want to stay here, but what choice did he have? Even the blind larva, the large-eyed creatures whom Duel had locked inside pitch-black rooms to process the mind-enhancing spice, Glitterstim, were growing restless. He had cared for them, given them food, a meager amount to keep their growth down, but enough for survival. But now they had begun to struggle. Duel snorted, making a squeaking sound with his bloated lips. The larvae were his own ungrateful children, immature rybets who had not yet undergone their final metamorphosis. Blind and worm-like, almost as large as Duel himself, the larvae were perfect workers to wrap the spice fibers in opaque sheaths, since even brief exposure to light would spoil the product. His children could work in the blackness and be happy. And what sort of gratitude did they show him? A few larvae had gotten loose, fleeing blindly through the winding prison passages, hiding in shadowy cells, waiting in darkened wings to ambush Duel if he came looking for them. But he was not going to look. He had more important things to do. To make things worse, one of the largest male larvae had freed all of Duel's specially picked females. The females had fled into the labyrinth of the prison, so that during his time of greatest terror, Duel couldn't even relieve his tension with an occasional visit to the harem. He had no choice but to remain locked inside his office cell, pace the floor, and be alternatively bored out of his mind and scared out of his wits. When he did make his way to the storerooms, he emerged heavily armed, waddled quickly down the corridors, and came back with as much food as he could carry. He had an escape tunnel, of course. He had blasted a channel into the spice mines directly under the prison. Duel could lose himself for a long time in that network, but he still couldn't get off planet. And lately the tunnels had become a far more dangerous place. After Dala's attack, most of the spice miners had fled. Without guards and construction and loud machinery, the spiders had surged upward to lay down their glitterstim webs along the walls. Looking with specially adapted kinetic energy detectors, Duel had spotted swarms of the monsters in the deepest shafts, migrating closer to the surface. In despair, Duel sat on his bunk and smelled the dank air of the dungeon. At another time he might have found it comforting and cool, but now he just rested his sucker-tipped fingers against damp jowls and stared at the monitors. He was astonished to see a ship land outside, and even though all humans generally looked alike to him, Duel was certain he recognized one of the three intruders pummeling his armored door. Han Solo, the man he hated most in the entire universe, the man who had caused all this misery. At the ominous prison gates, Han watched as Gent, the slicer, worked diligently on the problem. He jacked in all manner of equipment, components stolen out of other systems, barely functional combinations that somehow found loopholes around defense systems. Gent raised a triumphant fist into the grainy sunlight. The reinforced lattice work of the defensive portcullis rode up on invisible tracks. With a hollow clunking sound, the shipping and receiving gates split apart, squealing and creaking as they lumbered into the thick walls. A gust of higher pressure air bled out of the prison. The four large smugglers shouldered their weapons and plodded forward, crouched over and ready to fight. The two Mistral guards took the lead, sliding along the walls. The burly Whippet and scaly Trandoshan strode brashly down the middle of the hall. No attack came from the dark passageway. "Let's go find Moruth Duel," Han said. None of his options looked good, but Duel had to make choices. He had watched Han Solo and his group of commandos force their way in, and Kessel was supposed to be the toughest prison in the galaxy. Ha! Duel didn't know how to use the built-in defense systems, the external laser cannons, the disintegrator fields. He was helpless without his right-hand man, Skynix, but the scarecrowish fool had gotten himself killed chasing Solo through the spice tunnels, devoured by one of those energy spiders. As a desperate measure, Duel had come to the conclusion that he must trust his own children, the blind larvae he kept in blackness since the moment they writhed out of the gelatinous egg mass in the harem wing's breeding pools. Duel rushed down the corridors, gathering weapons from the prison's armory. He carried 2 satchels of blaster pistols over his shoulder as he opened the protective vaults. Suddenly exposed to the light, the larvae reared back like caterpillars, blind eyes bulging as they attempted to sense the identity of the intruder. "It's only me," Duel said. Bright lights stabbed at them, illuminating their pale skin. Damp, vestigial hands reached up, small fingers and arms short and weak, not completely formed. Worm-like tendrils quivered below their mouths as the larvae made soft burbling noises. Duel herded the oldest and strongest of the larvae along ramps to the lower levels. He would station them as guardians inside his cell. Being blind, they probably couldn't hit anything with the blasters, but he hoped they would at least fire with enthusiasm once he gave them the orders. Given enough crossfire, Duel could hide behind a blast-proof screen and hope the firefight would kill Solo's team. As Duel ushered them toward a cell, he smelled the musky wetness of their fear and uncertainty. The immature Rybets did not like change, preferring a rigid daily routine until eventually they molted and became adults, gaining intelligence and self-awareness. Distracted by trying to think of what other defenses he might bring to bear, he was startled by a high-pitched scream echoing from 3 of the nearby chambers. Several of the freed female Rybets sprang out, wailing and throwing sharp objects at him. Duel ducked as broken shards of transparent steel, sharpened knives, and heavy paperweights flew at him. Duel tried to grab a blaster from one of the 2 satchels on his back, but a drinking mug struck him on the soft side of his head. He dropped one of the satchels and ran wildly down the corridor, waving his sucker-tipped hands. Most of the larvae followed him, but a few split off to stay with their mothers. Duel ran, wanting only to get back to the safety of his cell. Finally slamming the thick door behind him, he emptied his remaining satchel and placed fully charged blasters in the hands of 6 potential defenders. "Just point it toward whatever noise you hear," he said. "When they break in, it's up to you to shoot. This is the firing button." The smooth-skinned creatures shivered and ran their sensitive mouth tendrils over the barrels of the weapons. "You point it, and it makes a blast." Duel repositioned the pistols in their vestigial hands, pointing them toward the door. Without warning, the vision in his mechanical eye flickered again, and Duel couldn't see a thing. He moaned in terror. The escape tunnel was sounding better and better. With a growing dread in the pit of his stomach, Han Solo hurried down the prison corridors. The entire place was full of cold shadows, echoing with emptiness. Over the comlink, Mara Jade said, "We've found him, Solo. He's barricaded in one of the dungeons. We tapped into the surveillance cameras. He's got some creatures standing with him, and they appear to be armed." "On my way," Han said. When he reached the lower corridors, Han saw heavy barricades thrown in place across a sealed door. Mara watched the operation as the 2 female Mistral guards placed concussion detonators around the door seal. Lando paced nervously. "Don't do any more damage than you have to," he said. "I've got enough repairs to make here on Kessel as it is." The 2 women ignored him as they sprinted out of the way. They ducked their heads and covered their ears as a rapid thud-thud-thud echoed from the concussion detonators. They heard a volley of sudden blaster fire from inside the sealed chamber, a high-pitched shriek of energetic beams striking and ricocheting off the walls. "No, no, not yet," came a howling voice that Han recognized as Moruth Duel's. With a final thump, the last concussion detonator blew the bottom off the door. The hairy whippet rushed forward to elbow the heavy plates aside. "Look out," Mara called. The whippet ducked and rolled as the soft larvae flailed, pointing their blasters and firing in every direction. Their huge glassy eyes spun around without seeing anything. "Get them!" Duel yelled. The larvae whirled at the sound of his voice and fired their blasters toward Duel himself, but he'd already ducked behind a thick piece of wall plating. "Not at me!" Hissing, the reptilian Trandoshans shot inside, cutting down 2 of the blind larvae. He lumbered into the chamber, but before the other smugglers could rush in, another explosion came from the ceiling. Han, Mara, and the Mistral guards used the distraction to muscle their way forward, ducking down and firing again. Han took out another of the larvae just as the ceiling collapsed in flaming chunks. Wailing for revenge, swarms of female Rybets dropped through the ceiling into Duel's private cell. Each bore a blaster of her own and fired repeatedly at the metal shield Duel hid behind until its center glowed a cherry red. The blind larvae targeted on the new noise, but then, as if suddenly they understood, as if they could communicate with their own mothers, the larvae turned and directed their fire toward Duel as well. "Stop! Stop!" Duel cried. Han crept in beside Lando, not wanting to draw fire in the midst of this civil war. Duel yelped and dropped the superheated protective shield. His mechanical eye popped off and broke into 1,000 bouncing and rattling components on the floor. His long, squishy fingers punched a hidden control button, and a trapdoor opened beneath him. With a mindless squeal, Duel leaped through an access hatch into an escape tunnel down into the cold, black mines. "Hurry, before he gets away," Lando said. "I don't want him running around in my spice mines." The surviving larvae flowed forward as if they wanted to plunge into the tunnels after Moruth Duel, either to follow him or to chase him. But the amphibious females grasped the larvae and held them back with gentle cooing sounds. Their wide eyes looked on the invading smugglers with apprehension. Han rushed toward the trapdoor and dropped to his knees, pushing his face into the darkness. He heard Duel's splatting footsteps diminishing as he ran on webbed feet deeper into the catacombs. The larva shot several blaster bolts into the passages after him. Long spears of heat bounced along the tunnel walls, kicking boulders loose. The light sparked a scintillating glare of activated glitterstim. Then Han heard a new sound that turned his blood cold. A faint but chilling noise. Hundreds of sharp legs, like ice picks, scrambling down the tunnel. Han could still hear Duel's footsteps getting fainter and fainter as he fled. Han heard the tick-tick-tick of multi-legged creatures, attracted by the heat of a living body, and Duel's gasping, ragged breath as the Rybit searched blindly for a way out. Han heard many more sets of pointed legs scrabbling, like a stampede from converging tunnels as the energy spiders found nourishment after the long silence in the spice mines. Han's skin crawled. At the tail end of the high-pitched and gut-wrenching scream, Duel's footsteps suddenly stopped. The scream cut off abruptly, as did the sound of running ice-pick feet. The instant silence seemed even more horrible than the scream, and Han quickly pulled up the trapdoor and secured it before the energy spiders could seek other prey. He sat back, heart pounding. The smugglers looked grimly satisfied at the battle they had won. The Whippet leaned against the wall with arms crossed. "A good hunt," he growled. The Trandoshan glanced from side to side as if seeking something to eat. The female Rybets hauled away the blasted larva, tending the injured, mourning over the dead. Han sighed as Lando sank down next to him. "Well, Lando," he said, "now you can start remodeling." Han, Lando, and Mara rode back up to the garrison moon in the Falcon. Mara and Lando spoke more easily to each other now that Lando wasn't pushing so hard to get the slightest word or smile from her. Mara had even stopped avoiding Lando's gaze or raising her chin whenever he spoke. She spent most of her time reassuring him that the Lady Luck would be just fine behind the security fields of the reoccupied prison. Lando didn't seem to believe her entirely, but he did not want to disagree with Mara Jade. "We got a lot of paperwork to do," Mara said. "I have all the standard contracts and agreements up at the moon base. We can take care of formalities between us, but there are still a lot of forms to digitize and sign, a lot of records to cross-reference." "Whatever you say," Lando said. "I want this to be a long and happy partnership. You and I need to figure out how we can best implement production on Kessel. It's in the best interest of both of us to get the glitterstim flowing soon, especially since I'm going to have to sink so much of an investment into the mining work again." Han listened to them talk, but devoted most of his thoughts to his family. "I just want to go home. No more side trips." The Falcon sped away from the wispy corona of escaping air toward the large moon. Once leaving the turbulent atmosphere of Kessel, they coasted smoothly in the vacuum of space as if on glass. Suddenly, an alert flashed on their communications panels from the moon base. "Warning! We've detected a large vessel approaching Kessel, and I mean large." Han reacted instantly. "Lando, check the scanners." Lando stared at the co-pilot station and sat up quickly, his eyes as big as viewports. "Not just large," he said. Han could see the globe-shaped object through the viewport, spherical but skeletal, cross-braced and arched with giant girders, the size of a miniature moon. "It's the Death Star." The repairs took longer than expected, much to Tol Sivrin's frustration, but the prototype was finally ready to approach and attack the nearest planetary system. Sivrin shifted in his seat, pleased to observe the stormtrooper captain giving all the right orders. Delegating responsibility was the first lesson of management. He liked sitting in the pilot's chair while others did the work. Squat, bald Dachshund leaned forward from one of the other chairs. "The target is coming into view, Director Sivrin." "Good," Sivrin said, looking at the streaked atmosphere fuzzing around the planet and its close orbiting moon. "There seems to be a significant ship activity in the area," Yem the Deveronian said. "I'm tracking and documenting it for posterity. We'll want a careful record in case we need to file a report on the performance of this prototype." "It's a rebel base," Tol Sivrin said. "No doubt about it. Look at those ships. Look at its position. There must be where our prisoner Han Solo came from." "How can you be sure?" said Golanda. Sivrin shrugged. "We need to test this Death Star, right? We got a handy target right here, so it might as well be a rebel base." The stormtrooper captain sat at the tactical station. "We're picking up numerous alarms from the moon base. It appears to be some sort of military installation." A flurry of ships departed from a large opening in the moon, spewing a random collection of well-armed and fast cruisers around Kessel. "They can't get away from us," Tol Sivrin said. "Target the planet. You may fire when ready." He smiled, and his pointed teeth formed a serrated edge against his lips. "I've got a good feeling about this." Doxson grinned in breathless delight. "I never thought I'd get a chance to see this weapon in action." "It's never been calibrated, you know," Galanda said with a sour expression. "That's a planet-destroying super laser," Doxson shot back. "We can turn that whole world into rubble. How well does it need to be calibrated?" "Targeting now," the stormtrooper captain said. In shielded firing chambers below, lit only by flickering blazes of colored light from complex control panels, other stormtroopers functioned as Death Star gunners, after having been told to scour the instruction manuals. "What's taking so long?" Tol Sivrin fidgeted against the uncomfortable fabric of the command seat. Suddenly, the white noise background hum of the operating systems dropped an octave. The lights dimmed on the panels as the prototype consumed an incredible amount of energy. Out the front viewport, past main support struts that arched like giant steel rainbows over their heads, smaller superlaser beams fired out of the Death Star's focusing eye, phasing together at the intersection point. The green beam gained in power and lanced out in an immense blast, greater in diameter than a starship. Its target erupted in a blaze of smoke, fire, and incandescent rubble. Tol Sivrin applauded. Yem took careful notes. Doxson let out a cry of triumph and amazement. "You missed," Golanda said. Tol Sivrin blinked his small dark eyes. "What?" "You hit the moon, not the planet." He saw she was right. The moon that had served as a garrison for the fighter ships had exploded into fragmented rubble that was raining down in spectacular meteor showers on the planet Kessel. The fighter ships that had evacuated from the moon base swarmed about in a flurry, like fire mantides disturbed from their nests during mating season. Tol Sivrin coiled and uncoiled his naked head tails, feeling tingles along his nerve endings. He leaned back in the chair and waved a clawed hand in dismissal. "That can be corrected. The target was irrelevant. At least now we know the prototype is fully functional." He nodded approvingly. "Just as all the progress reports said." Sivrin took a deep breath, feeling the thrill build within him. "Now we can put this weapon to use." 29. Leia was amazed that Mon Mothma still clung to life. Anxiously, she stood over the deathbed of the chief of state, looking at the kaleidoscope of medical apparatus and life support systems that refused to let Mon Mothma die. The auburn-haired woman had once been such a fiery rival of Leia's father on the Senate floor. Now she could no longer stand on her feet. Her skin was gray and translucent, thin as crumpled parchment in a framework of bones. Her eyelids struggled open as if they were heavy blast doors. Her eyes took a long time to focus on her visitor. Leia swallowed, feeling hot lead in her stomach. She reached out with trembling fingers to touch Mon Mothma's arm, afraid that the slightest pressure could cause bruises. "Leia," Mon Mothma whispered. "You came." "I came because you asked me to," Leia said. Hana dropped her and the children off on Coruscant, grumbling about having to go away with Lando, but promising to return in only a few days. She would believe that when it happened. In the meantime, Leia was shocked to see the accelerating decline in Mon Mothma's condition. "Your children are safe now?" "Yes. Winter is staying here to protect them. I won't let them be taken from me again." Leia would be even busier than before. She would see less of Han, less of her children. Momentarily, she envied the peaceful life of a lower functionary who could leave work at the end of the day and go home, letting unfinished tasks wait for tomorrow. But she had been born a Jedi and raised by Senator Bail Organa. Her life had been focused toward a greater destiny, and she could not shirk either her public or her private burden. Leia took a deep breath, tasting the nauseating chemicals that clung to the air, the disinfectants, the medicines, the ozone smell of atmospheric sterilizers. She felt so helpless. Her excitement at defeating the Imperial Strike Force and rescuing her son seemed trivial in the face of Mon Mothma's battle against the slow-acting poison. Leia took little consolation in knowing that Ambassador Fergan was no longer alive to gloat. Mon Mothma spoke ponderously, "have tendered my resignation to the Council. I will no longer serve as Chief of State." Leia realized that empty encouragements would be useless. She reacted in a way that Mon Mothma had taught her to respond, thinking of the New Republic first. "What about the government?" she said. "Won't the council bicker with each other and accomplish nothing because they can't reach a consensus? Who will they look to for leadership?" She looked down at Mon Mothma, and the haggard woman blinked at her with shining, hopeful eyes. "You will be our leader, Leia," Mon Mothma said. Leia blinked in shock and opened her mouth. Mon Mothma found the strength to nod slightly. "Yes, Leia. While you were away, the council met to discuss our future. My resignation is no surprise to anyone, and we voted unanimously that you should be my replacement." "But," Leia said. Her heart pounded, her mind whirled. She had not expected this, at least not now. Perhaps after another decade or two of dedicated service, then. "You, Leia, will be the chief of state for the New Republic. If I had any strength left to give, I would give it all to you. You'll need it to hold this newborn republic of ours together." Mon Mothma closed her eyes and squeezed Leia's hand with a surprisingly firm grip. "Even when I'm gone, I'll be watching over you." Speechless, Leia knelt at Mon Mothma's bedside for a long time, far into Coruscant's night. 30. Inside Maw installation, one of the members of Wedge's Special Forces teams had deciphered enough of the primary controls to sound the facility-wide alarm. Through the intercom system, an unfamiliar voice barked, "Red alert! An Imperial Star Destroyer has entered the vicinity. Red alert! Prepare for attack." Wedge stood next to Qui inside her empty old laboratory as they gaped at the scarred and blackened hulk of the Gorgon. The mammoth ship maneuvered into position over the cluster of lashed-together rocks. "Oh my," 3PO said. "I thought we were supposed to be safe in here." Wedge grabbed Qui's pale hand. "Come on, we have to get to the operations room." They ran through the corridors. Qui did her best to lead him, though frequently she couldn't remember which direction to go. 3PO, his servo motors whirring, tottered after them as fast as he could go. "Wait for me! Oh, why does this always happen?" Inside the operations room, Wedge was relieved to see that a dozen of his troops had gotten there ahead of him and were already scrambling to operate the controls. A few of the computer banks had malfunctioned, but the rest had been jump-started. Sensor arrays spilled data across their screens. Wedge put his hands on Qui's shoulders, pressing his face close to hers and looking into her big eyes. "Qui, try to remember. Does Maw installation have any of its own defenses?" She looked up through the lattice's skylight, seeing the looming arrowhead shape of the Star Destroyer. Qui pointed up. "Those were our defenses. Maw installation depended entirely upon Admiral Dalla's fleet." She hurried over to one of the deadened computer consoles and used her musical keypad to whistle her password into the system, hoping to bypass the damaged circuits with her own files and select some of the higher-order functioning routines. "We do have shields," Qui said. "If only we could increase them." 5 hairy technicians came over to help her, using their own expertise to access the generators and reinforce the protective force field around the primary planetoids. "That'll hold for now against an assault," a tech said. "But this makes me very uncomfortable, General Antilles. The power reactor's already unstable, and we're placing a tremendous strain on it. We could be sealing our own fate." Wedge's gaze flicked to Qui and then back to the soldiers. "Well, it's a certain death if we don't do something to protect ourselves now. We've taken what we need. I think it's time to leave Maw installation. Have the ships prepare for departure." "If Dalla will let us," Qui said. "I doubt she'll allow us to walk off now that we've uncovered its secrets." Wedge's eyes suddenly blinked in realization. "We took one of the Corvette engines offline for spare parts for the power reactor. One of my ships is crippled and can't move." He ran to the communication station and switched on a narrow beam to the disabled Corvette. "Captain Ortola, launch all starfighter squadrons from your bay, now. Take all personnel and shuttle over to the Yavaris or one of the other 2 Corvettes. Without maneuverability, your ship is a prime target." "Yes, sir," Captain Ortola's voice acknowledged. The broad trapezoidal view screen at the far end of the operations room surged with static, and then an image of fiery-haired Admiral Dalla filled the screen. She leaned forward into the viewing area. Her eyes seemed to throw pointed javelins right into Wedge's heart. "Rebel scum! You'll not leave Maw installation alive. The information contained in this facility is now forfeit, tainted by your sabotage. I'm not interested in your surrender or your flight, only your destruction. Dalla ended the transmission herself before Wedge could formulate a reply. He shook his head at the flickering static that faded into a dull gray. He turned back to Quee and felt his heart pounding. Quee, are you sure there's nothing else we can use? Any other weapon? Wait, Quee said. Chewbacca took a team down into the maintenance bay to rescue the Wookiee slaves. There were always several assault shuttles or fighter ships being worked on. Maybe those? One of the New Republic commandos snapped his head up. Assault shuttles? Probably Gamma class. They're nothing spectacular, but they are heavily armored and well outfitted with weapons, worth 10 of our starfighters. It could be a welcome addition to the battle. Dalla's only got one Star Destroyer against us, but she still outguns the combined force of the Corvettes and the Yavaris. The squad leader looked down at a scrolling list of equipment on a data screen. Just as I feared, sir. These are old models. They require a piloting droid to fly complicated maneuvers, especially in this gravitational environment. We could probably do it with only one droid and cross-link to the separate navigational systems. At that moment, with heavy footfalls and buzzing servo motors, 3PO hurried into the operations room, emitting a loud sigh of relief. Ah, there you are. I finally found you. Wedge, Quee, and everyone else turned to look at the golden droid. 3PO moved forward, his arms waving in dismay as he negotiated a steep ramp into the rock-lined maintenance bay. I don't know why everyone keeps treating me as if I were some sort of property, he said. Chewbacca grunted a sharp retort, and 3PO snapped at him. That's quite beside the point. In actual fact, Chewbacca lifted up the golden droid and set him bodily on the entrance ramp of a Gamma-class assault shuttle. The recently freed Wookiee slaves, along with a group of New Republic commandos, scrambled into the 5 armored shuttles that remained in the bay. Each ship had been maintained in perfect working order by Wookiee crews. From above, sudden hollow thumps echoed through the asteroid as the Gorgon pummeled them with turbo-laser blasts. Chewbacca and the other Wookiees howled at the ceiling, their bestial noises echoing louder than the thunder of attack. Faint dust trickled down, split from the sealed rock walls. I still think I'm going to regret this, 3PO said. I wasn't designed for this kind of work. I can communicate with other tactical computers and coordinate your flight paths, but putting me in charge of strategy... Chewbacca ignored him and climbed into the vehicle. Seeing that his arguments were useless, the golden droid shuffled up the ramp to the confines of the assault shuttle. But then again, I am always happy to help where needed. The other Wookiees, including stunted old Nalron, took their places in the gunnery seats, ready to blast TIE fighters. Chewbacca slumped into the assault shuttle's too small pilot seat and made 3PO sit beside him in the co-pilot's chair. Oh, very well, 3PO said, and inspected the computer, deciding how best to communicate with it. More explosions from the Gorgon's attack pounded through the thick walls, but those noises were soon drowned out by the growling purr of the shuttle's repulsor lift engines. Chewbacca raised the heavy armed ship off the floor and guided it down the launching corridor. Atmosphere containment fields sealed behind them just before the heavy launch doors opened into space like a huge vertical mouth. 3PO blinked up to the guidance computers and the directional programming of all 5 assault shuttles. Behind them, identical vehicles flew in a tight formation, picking up speed. This is rather exhilarating, 3PO said. Chewbacca punched the controls until the shuttle rocketed like a projectile through the launch doors and away from the installation's protective screen. Above, swarms of starfighters streamed from the Corellian corvettes. The frigate Yavaris began to fire on the Star Destroyers. Dalla continued to rain turbo-laser bolts upon the installation. From the lower bay doors of the Gorgon, squads of TIE fighters streaked out like spooked Minocs from a cave. Chewbacca powered up his weapon systems, and 3PO linked into their pre-programmed attack patterns. The 5 assault shuttles from Maw installation plunged into the heart of the burgeoning space battle. Oh my, 3PO said. 31. When Leia answered the summons at the door to her quarters in the rebuilt Imperial Palace, she saw it was the deepest hour of the bustling night. For a moment she had a thrilled thought that Han might have come back from Kessel already, but when she rubbed sleep from her eyes and opened the door, she found her brother Luke standing there. She paused a moment, utterly astonished, and then rushed forward to embrace him. Luke! When did you come to Coruscant? Out of the corner of her eye she caught sight of another young man standing off to the side in the dim corridor. She recognized the tousled dark hair of Kip Duran. His eyes were deep-set and averted, no longer the brash teenager that Han had rescued from the spice mines at Kessel. "Oh, Kip," she said in a flat, unemotional voice. Seeing the young man unnerved her. He had been Han's dear friend, a companion through enjoyable adventures, but Kip had also gone over to the dark side, paralyzed Luke, killed millions of people, turned on Han. Kip's face and eyes looked old now, exhausted from the traumas he'd endured and caused. Leia had seen eyes like those only once before, on her brother after he had faced the knowledge that Darth Vader was his own father. But Kip had been through a hell as deep as Luke's had been. A small courier droid shot down the hall, blinking red lights to warn others to clear the way as it propelled itself along on urgent business, even this late at night. With a flush of embarrassment, Leia remembered her manners. "Please come in." From the back room, Winter emerged, sliding forward on silent bare feet, wearing only a loose sleeping garment. Winter appeared ready for action, lest some other danger throw itself upon the children. She bowed her head formally when she saw Luke. "Greetings, Master Skywalker," she said. Luke smiled and nodded to her. "Hello, Winter." Winter backed into her chambers. "I'll just check on the children," she said. She vanished, giving them no chance to say anything else. Leia looked from Kip to Luke again, feeling deep weariness behind her eyes, behind her head. She'd been relying on too many stimulant drinks, spending too much time negotiating with other council members, sleeping too little. Luke closed the door behind him as he and Kip entered the common room. Leia remembered when her brother had trained her in this room, trying to unlock her Jedi potential. Now, though, she sensed that Luke had a much more ominous agenda. "Is Han here?" Kip blurted, looking round the quarters. Leia noticed that he still wore the black cape Han had given him as a gift, but now Kip seemed to carry it as a symbol over a light jumpsuit, a reminder to himself of what he could become. "He's gone off to Kessel with Lando," Leia said, a tired smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "Lando wants to try running the spice mines." Kip frowned uncertainly. Luke sat down on one of the self-conforming cushions and leaned forward, weaving his fingers together. He directed his intense gaze at Leia. "Leia, we need your help," he said. "Yeah, I figured that out," Leia answered with a touch of irony. "I'll do everything I can, of course. What do you need?" "Kip and I have made our peace. He has the potential to be the greatest of the Jedi I'm training, but there's one thing he must do before I can consider him completely absolved." Leia swallowed, already afraid of what he might say. "And what is this one thing?" Luke did not flinch. "The Sun Crusher must be destroyed. Everyone in the New Republic knows that, but Kip must do it himself." Leia simply blinked, unable to say anything. "But how can he destroy it?" she finally said. "As far as we know, it's indestructible. We already dropped it into a gas planet's core, but Kip—" She turned her exaggerated gaze on the young man. "Managed to retrieve it. I don't suppose even dropping it into a sun would have made much difference." Kip shook his head. "No, I could have recovered it just as easily." Leia looked helplessly at Luke, spreading her hands. "So what else?" "Kip and I will fly the Sun Crusher back to the Maw. He will set the autopilot and drop it into one of the black holes. Quantum armor or no quantum armor, it will be obliterated. There's no more definite way of erasing something from this universe." Kip piped up. "I know the Sun Crusher must be taken away from both the Empire and the New Republic. Dr. Zooks no longer has any memory of how to reconstruct it. The galaxy will never need to fear such a threat again." His posture stiffened, his chin rose, his eyes grew alive again. The guilt and pain were replaced with a look of pride and determination. Luke placed a hand on the young man's forearm, and Kip fell silent, content to let Luke continue. "Leia, I know you've been appointed to the new chief of state. You can make this happen." He leaned forward, speaking to her with the idealistic, boyish energy she remembered from years before. "You know I'm right." Leia shook her head, already afraid of the enormous diplomatic battle she would have to face at the mere mention of Luke's preposterous request. "There'll be a lot of heated discussion. Most of the council members are going to refuse to let Kip get within sight of the Sun Crusher again. What's to stop him from rampaging around the galaxy and blowing up more star systems? Can they take that risk? Can we?" "They have to take that risk," Luke said. "It must be done. And I'll be there with him." Leia bit her lip. Her brother could be so forceful. She knew him well enough that she wasn't simply awed by what the Jedi could do, but she was confident that Luke could follow through on his claim. "Do you know what you're asking?" she asked in a soft, pleading voice. "Leia, just as I had to face our father, this is a test Kip must complete. Tell the Council that if he passes this test successfully, Kip Durron could become the most powerful Jedi Knight of this generation." Leia sighed and stood up. "All right, I'll try." Kip interrupted her and said, "There is no try. Do or do not." Then he allowed himself a wry smile, gesturing toward Luke. At least that's what he always says. 32. Han Solo gritted his teeth as he yanked on the Falcon's controls. The modified light freighter flew up and around in a tight backward loop. The blinding flash of the Death Star's super laser faded to a glowing streak as the rubble of Kessel's moon mushroomed in a rapidly expanding cloud. "That was going to be my garrison!" Lando cried. His voice cracked. "First Moruth duel, now a Death Star. This deal is getting worse all the time." Mara Jade, her face hard as chiseled stone, quickly leaned between Han and Lando in the two cockpit seats and shouted into the comm unit. "This is Mara Jade. All ships report. How many did we lose? Did the evacuation order go out on time?" One of the cool-voiced Mistral guards responded. "Yes, Commander Jade," the warrior woman said. "We scrambled at first sight of the intruder. All but 2 ships made it away from the base. One more was struck and destroyed by the flying debris." Mara nodded grimly. "Then we still have enough of a fighting force," she said. "Fighting force?" Han said. "Against that thing? To do what? It's a Death Star, not a cargo freighter." He looked through the overhead viewport and saw the skeletal prototype over Kessel. The superweapon seemed to be brooding over the destruction it had just caused. "But Han," Lando pleaded, "we gotta do something before it blows up the planet, too. Think of all the spice down there." Mara grabbed the comm again. "Attack formation, Gamma," she said. "We're going to head out and pound that Death Star." She turned to Han and lowered her voice. "If it's just a prototype, my guess is they won't have the defenses the real Death Star had. No squadrons of TIE fighters, no turbo-laser fortifications across the surface. That's what did the most damage to your rebel fleets, wasn't it?" "Not entirely," Lando said. "The second Death Star used its super laser against a few of our capital ships." Mara pursed her lips as she thought. "Then we'll just have to keep them busy. I don't think that super laser can be very effective at targeting small moving objects." "I don't like the odds on that," Lando said. "Never quote me the odds," Han said, hunching over the panel and guiding the ship into position. "Who, me?" Lando said, raising his eyebrows. "I'm a sucker for lost causes." The Millennium Falcon soared into the vanguard of the smugglers' attack formation. Han was impressed to see the assortment of large and small ships fall into a perfect pattern, as if they were trained and regimented. The motley bunch must have a great deal of respect for Mara Jade, he realized. As a rule, smugglers were notoriously independent and took orders from no one. One of the other ships, an insectile Z-95 Headhunter, the type of ship Mara herself often flew, streaked in beside the Falcon. Its pilot spoke over the open channel. "This is Kithra. I'll take the right-hand prong. Shanna will take the left. You fly center, Falcon, and we'll hit the Death Star in all 3 places at once." Han recognized the no-nonsense voice of another Mistral guard. How many had she brought along with her? "Agreed, Kithra," Mara said. She turned to look at Han. "Well, Solo, ready to lead the attack?" "I never intended to take the Falcon against a Death Star," he groaned, even as he prepared for battle. "I was just giving Lando a lift to Kessel." "Think of it as an added bonus," Mara said. "Come on, Han," Lando urged, "before that Death Star fires again." "Good thing Leia's not here," he muttered. "She'd probably succeed in talking me out of this." As the ships converged on the skeletal behemoth, the super laser struck once more, scorching the fabric of space with emerald fire, but the beam passed through the scattered ships descending upon it, causing no damage. "Shields up," Han said, "for whatever good it'll do against that." On either side of the Falcon, 2 segments of the smuggler fleet peeled off like the skin from a rattlesnake, one prong led by Kithra and her headhunter, the other headed by Shanna and an angular blockade runner, a clunkier forerunner of the Falcon's light freighter design. The smuggler ships drove in, energy cannons blazing, drawing a deadly tracery of fire across the superstructures and girders of the enormous sphere. Han launched 3 proton torpedoes into the labyrinth of crossbeams and supports as they charged toward the enormous construction. A few reinforced girders glowed molten as projectiles and energy beams hit. It's going to take us a year to chop away at this thing, Han said, firing from the Falcon's forward weaponry. I never claimed this was going to be easy, Mara said. Tol Siverin's head-tails twitched. He squinted his black beady eyes at the oncoming small ships. They appeared so trivial, their weapon systems so minor. I can't believe they're attacking us, he said. What do they think they're going to accomplish? At the tactile station, the stormtrooper captain spoke through his white helmet. If I might point out, Director, this battle station is for proof of concept only. It was never designed to defend itself against multiple small threats. In fact, the Death Star was meant to house over 7,000 TIE fighters, not to mention thousands of surface turbo lasers and ion cannons, and an escort of several Imperial-class Star Destroyers. We have none of these. Individually, those rebel ships may be only a minor threat, but together they can harry us for an extended period, and if we are unlucky, cause significant structural damage. You mean we don't have any fighters of our own? Tol Siverin said with stern disapproval. That was poor planning. Who wrote that section of the procedure? I want to know right now. Director, the stormtrooper said with a tinge of exasperation in his filtered voice. That doesn't matter at the moment. It matters to me, Tol Siverin said. He turned toward demon-faced Yem, who was already scouring the records. It appears that Dr. Kui Zux was responsible for that section, Director, Yem said. She devoted much of her time to the operation and performance of the super laser, giving short shift to tactical considerations. Siverin sighed. I see we found a flaw in our approval system. Such weak spots should never have been allowed to pass through the progress reports and review meetings. Director, Doxson said, let us not allow this to overshadow the marvelous performance of the Death Star superlaser itself. Agreed, Siverin said. We should have a meeting immediately to discuss the implications of... The stormtrooper captain stood up from his station. Director, we must establish certain priorities right now. We are under attack. An outside explosion made the Death Star framework around the control chamber vibrate. That's 3 direct hits with proton torpedoes, the stormtrooper said. So far. As Siverin watched, 4 Z-95 headhunters swooped out of the superstructure, their rear engines blazing. Well then, fire again with our laser, Tol Siverin said. Maybe you can hit one of them this time. The power core is only half charged, Doxson pointed out. Siverin whirled and parted his lips to show pointed teeth. Isn't that good enough to knock out a few little ships? Doxson blinked his piggish eyes as if he hadn't considered the possibility. Why, yes, sir. Yes, it is. Ready to fire. At your convenience, Division Leader, Siverin said. Eagerly, Doxson spoke into the intercom, commanding the gunners to fire. After a few seconds, the incredible beam of light seared out. Side lasers converged at a focal point and coalesced into a laser battering ram that plowed through the fringe of the oncoming cluster of fighters, vaporizing one old blockade runner in the vanguard of the left prong. Another ship was damaged by the backwash of the blast, but the attacking forces spread out and disappeared into the superstructure like parasites, firing again. Did you see that? Doxson said with obvious pleasure. We hit one. Hooray, Golanda said sourly from her seat. Her voice carried absolutely no enthusiasm. Only about 40 more to go, and you can't even fire the super laser again for 15 minutes. Director, if I might make a suggestion, the stormtrooper captain said. We have successfully tested the prototype laser, but to stay here any longer would serve no purpose. To endure unnecessary damage to this fine weapon is folly. We should protect the Death Star so we may present it intact to the Imperial authorities. And what do you suggest doing, Captain? Tol Siverin said. He dug his long claws into the armrests. We should withdraw to the Maw cluster. I doubt these small ships will follow. We are not highly maneuverable, but we can build up considerable speed. Note that we don't need to go all the way back to the installation, just to the opposite side of the cluster where we can hide. The captain paused and said slowly, Once there, you will have time to hold a lengthy meeting to decide what to do. You can discuss the whole situation by committee if you like. Tol Siverin brightened. Good idea, Captain. See to it. Let's head out of here as fast as we can. The stormtrooper captain fed in a new course for the prototype. The huge open framework sphere wheeled about on its axis and accelerated away from Kessel, cumbersome but picking up speed as if it left in a flurry of other ships behind. After the blaze from the Death Star's third blast faded, Han Solo rubbed sparkles out of his eyes, seeing distorted colors. That was too close, he said. The fringe of the beam fried our forward shields. Shauna's old blockade runner had been destroyed, and some ships now flew off in retreat. We have to regroup, Kithra's voice came over the comm system. I think we should just get out of here, Han said. Look, Lando interrupted as the arching framework of the Death Star spun about and began to accelerate away from Kessel. We've got it on the run. For now, Mara said, but it may just be retreating long enough to recharge its power core so it can strike again. Kessel won't be safe while that thing is out there, Lando said. Han, we've got to go in. Let's take the Falcon all the way to the power core. Are you crazy, Lando? Han asked, his voice rising. This is my ship, remember? I'm not contesting that, Lando said, holding his hands up. But I've flown her into a Death Star before, remember? I got a bad feeling about this, Han mumbled, and he shot a sidelong glance at Mara Jade. But you're right. We can't just run away. If the prototype falls into the hands of the Imperial Navy, it could cause a lot more misery than I want to be responsible for. Let's go in. He punched his accelerators. Mara sent orders to her fleet. All ships back off. We're going in. Alone. The Falcon cruised through the nightmarish maze of overhanging girders, coolant and ventilation systems, power conduits and substations that formed the inner structure of the Death Star prototype. Catwalks laced the open spaces like so many spiderwebs. The Falcon shot inward, tunneling deeper and deeper into the construction as the framework grew closer, more complex. Han spun the ship left and right to squeeze through narrow passages. Just ahead, in the middle of a huge open corridor, a mammoth-sized construction crane toppled from its moorings, dislodged by the smuggler attack and the sudden lurching movement of the prototype. The crane fell, tumbling in silence through the vacuum of space, directly into the path of the Falcon. Look out! Lando cried. Han punched the firing buttons and sent out a converging blast from his laser cannons, disintegrating the falling machine into the expanding plume of incandescent gas and metal steam. Lando leaned back and closed his eyes with a shuddering sigh. As the Falcon careened through, the passengers were bumped and jostled. Large debris struck the deflector shields. Sparks flew out of the control panels, and smoke poured from the engine panels beneath the floor plates. We got damage, Lando yelled. Han fought for control. She'll hold together, he said, as if praying. Suddenly, the Death Star jerked and slammed forward as its heavy-duty sublight engines fired up. Han tried to match the speed, spiraling closer to the power core. The Falcon lurched, barely responding to Han's attempts to maneuver. They passed gargantuan girders, ringing the outer core, tumbling into a vast enclosed space, a spherical chamber that contained the two gleaming conical sections of the power core. Green and blue fire crackled between the contacts as reactors pumped up the energy level, recharging the weapon to fire again. Talk about recurring nightmares, Lando said. I never wanted to see anything like this again in my life. I guess we're just lucky, Han said, scanning his damage reports. We need repairs bad, he said through gritted teeth. Lousy time for the engines to act up. The Death Star rotated again, changing course and accelerating once more with equatorial propulsion units. Han narrowly avoided an arc-shaped girder that swung across to slam at them. He maneuvered the Falcon around it in a tight loop and limped toward the superstructure that held the reactor core in place. I need to check on those engines, Han said, but I can't do anything while the Death Star is moving and rocking like this. We're going to have to settle in for the ride. Settle in? Mara asked in astonishment. Don't get all bent out of shape. I did this once before to elude Imperial pursuit, he said, flashing a lopsided grin. A nice little trick built into the Falcon. Added it myself. Han brought the ship up parallel to one of the thick girders. It's my landing claw. I used it to hang on to the back of a Star Destroyer, then drifted off with the garbage as the fleet entered hyperspace. The Falcon attached itself with a clang. Directly below them, the towering cylinder of the power core blazed into the emptiness, shining its deadly light. We're secure here for now, Han said, but if they plan to go back inside the black hole cluster, we could be in for one wild ride. 33. Riding together in the close confines of the Sun Crusher, Luke felt young Kip Duron draw mentally closer to him as they journeyed toward the black hole cluster. Kip was gradually overcoming his fear and preoccupation with Jedi powers and the potential for abusing them. After his epiphany inside the temple of Exar Kun, Kip had emerged stronger, able to accept the challenge. If he could face this final test, Luke would know that Kip had passed through the fire of his testing, tempered by forces as dire and powerful as those Luke himself had endured. Luke smiled as he recalled how Leia had argued for Kip in the council meeting, fighting for the chance that Luke offered. During her very first session as leader of the New Republic, Leia had presented her brother's demand. In the uproar that followed, she had reasoned, cajoled, or shamed every one of them into giving Luke a chance. She had emerged from the hours-long meeting in the middle of a bright Coruscant day. Kip and Luke, waiting for her in one of the high mezzanine cafes within the enormous Imperial Palace, had sipped warm drinks and sampled delicacies from 100 planets that had sworn allegiance to the New Republic. Leia had brushed aside her 2 bodyguards and hurried forward to meet them, as other bureaucrats and minor functionaries stood up from their tables in recognition of their new chief of state. Leia ignored the attention. Her face was haggard and exhausted, but she could not hide her satisfied smile and the twinkle in her large eyes. "The Sun Crusher is yours to dispose of," she had said. "You'd better take it before someone on the council decides my victory was too easy and moves to reopen the discussion." Then Leia had turned a stern face toward Kip. "I'm gambling my entire future administration on you, Kip." "I won't let you down," Kip had promised, holding his head high. Luke did not need Jedi powers to sense the determination in the young man. They had flown away from Coruscant into hyperspace on a direct course for the Maw Cluster near Kessel. The 2 of them ate rations and shared a warm silence. When they finished, Kip fell into a deep rejuvenation trance, a form of death-like hibernation that Luke taught all his students. The young Jedi awoke after only an hour, looking greatly refreshed. En route, Kip had shared fond memories of his home planet Dyer. He spoke in a halting, wistful voice about his brother's death. As Luke listened with quiet understanding, Kip let loose his sorrow and wept cleansing tears, finally allowing himself the freedom granted by the vision of his brother's spirit in the obsidian temple. "Yoda made me take a test of my own," Luke told him. "I had to go into a cave in the swamps of Dagobah, where I confronted a vision of Darth Vader. I attacked and defeated him, only to find that I was fighting myself. I failed my test, but you succeeded." Luke looked into Kip's dark eyes. "I don't promise it will be easy, Kip, but the rewards of your efforts will be great, and the entire galaxy will benefit from them." Kip looked away as if embarrassed and studied the piloting controls of the Sun Crusher. "Ready to come out of hyperspace," he said. "You strapped in?" Luke nodded with a slight smile. Around them, hyperspace looked bruised and distorted from their proximity to all the black holes. Kip stared at the chronometer and concentrated as the numbers spun by. 3, 2, 1. He released the levers, and suddenly the blur sprang away from their viewport, and real space snapped into crystal focus around them. Luke saw the distant gaseous nod of the maw, but he instantly felt a wrenching inside as if something was terribly wrong. "What happened to Kessel?" Kip said. Luke found the much closer, distorted shape of Kessel, masked by an expanding debris cloud. "The Garrison Moon," Kip said. "It's gone." "We've been detected," Luke said. "Ships coming in." He sensed the anger and dismay from the pilots in the attack ships now gathering speed and converging on the Sun Crusher. The speaker buzzed with a forceful female voice. "This is Kithra of the Mistral Guard, representing the Smugglers' Alliance. Identify yourself and state your business in the Kessel system." "This is Luke Skywalker," he said, restraining a confident smile. "We're here on business for the New Republic. Our mission is to destroy the Sun Crusher, and we'd hoped to hitch a ride back to Coruscant with one of your ships. Mara Jade cleared us by subspace transmission only yesterday." "Commander Jade is not here now," Kithra said, "but she did notify me you would be coming. As you can see, though, we've recently been under attack." "Tell me your situation," Luke said. "Where's Mara? Is she okay? What about Han Solo?" Kip let his eyes fall half-closed, reaching out with the Force, searching. He jerked his head to the left, toward the swirling mass of the maw. "Han's there. He's over there." Kithra's voice came over the speaker again. "A Death Star prototype attacked us," she explained as the smugglers' ships swarmed around them in a protective contingent. "We suspect it was fleeing the New Republic occupation force that recently entered the cluster." "Wedge and Chewie are inside the maw, too," Luke said to Kip. "What happened to Han?" Kip said into the comm with rising urgency. Our ship struck at the prototype and caused some minor external damage, but Han Solo flew the Millennium Falcon into the superstructure. Commander Jade ordered us to fall back. The Falcon was carried along as the Death Star retreated toward the Maw. We were going to attempt to sabotage its power core, but we've had no word from them since. How long has it been? Only a couple of hours, Kithra answered. We've been considering our options. Luke looked at Kip, and their eyes met in shared concern. We don't have any options, Luke said. Kip nodded. We've got to help Han. Yes, Luke said, swallowing hard. Into the maw. For two Jedi, finding a safe path through the labyrinth of gravity wells proved simple enough. Working together, Luke and Kip reinforced each other's perceptions, flying the Sun Crusher in tandem like linked nav computers. The Sun Crusher rattled and vibrated with the strain. Luke experienced the stretching of his mind as he let his senses extend outward, as if dragged downward into the bottomless black holes. Kip flew with his eyes closed, his jaws clenched, his lips drawn back in a grimace. Almost through the wall, he said through his teeth. After passing through an eternity of super-hot colors, they fell into the quiet bubble within the center of the cluster. Clearing his vision, Luke searched for the Death Star prototype, expecting to see it firing at Wedge's assault fleet, but instead he saw quite a different space battle in progress. New Republic forces blasting, starfighters launched into frantic dogfights, arrayed not against the Death Star, but against the deadly spearpoint shape of a battered and blaster-scarred Star Destroyer. It's Admiral Dalla, Kip said, his voice thick with hatred. 34. The wire-frame prototype hid, powered down on the far side of the Maw cluster, as Tol Sivrin, Golanda, Doxson, Yem, and the stormtrooper captain held a meeting to discuss the implications of their changed situation. It had taken some time to find an empty storeroom that could be converted into an appropriate conference chamber, and they had to forego their hot beverages and morning pastries. But these were emergency times, Sivrin admitted, and they had to make sacrifices in the name of the Empire. Thank you, Captain, for pointing out that loophole in our procedures, he said, flashing a pointy-toothed smile. The stormtrooper had shown them an appendix to the emergency procedures, under the subheading Dissemination of Information, a clause pertaining to the total secrecy of Maw installation inventions. Rebel access to Maw installation research and development data must be denied at all costs. This clause, he argued, could be interpreted as mandating the destruction of the facility, now that it had been overrun. At all costs, the captain repeated, clearly means we should forfeit the installation itself, rather than let the rebels have access to our work. Well, Doxson said, it would give us another opportunity to fire the super laser for the good of the Empire. He raised his wire-thin eyebrows so that his scalp furrowed like tread marks across a sand dune. Yem, the Deveronian, continued to flip through paragraph after paragraph of the procedures on his datapad, studying the terminology. I see nothing to contradict the captain's assessment, Director Sivrin, he said. All right, the resolution is passed, Sivrin said. We shall direct the prototype back into the Maw, using our previous flight path. Captain, take care of the details. Yes, sir, the stormtrooper captain said. So that's all settled then, Tol Sivrin said, clacking his long claws on the tabletop. If we have no new business, the meeting is adjourned. Everyone stood to leave, brushing their uniforms and stepping away from the table. Tol Sivrin looked at the small chronometer. Barely 2 hours had passed. He blinked his beady eyes in surprise. This had been one of his shortest meetings ever. 35. 3PO's dizzying preoccupation with battle configurations and tactics and ships swarming around the 5 Gamma assault shuttles absorbed all his concentration. He forgot entirely about his dread. The Gorgon cruised ominously overhead, firing down on the installation or shooting across at the New Republic ships. Chewbacca growled, squinting his fur-rimmed eyes to study the Star Destroyer's firing pattern. He chuffed and grunted an idea to 3PO, and without waiting for a response, opened the tight beam ship-to-ship communications systems. Chewbacca spoke rapidly in the Wookiee language, which 3PO decided was a tactically wise thing to do. Although he himself was a protocol droid and understood more than 6 million forms of communication, he doubted that anyone on the Gorgon would know what Chewbacca was saying. Even as acknowledgement came from the Wookiee pilots and the other assault shuttles, 3PO broke away from his full concentration to speak to the Wookiee. I simply don't see how we can possibly take out all the starboard turbo laser banks on the Star Destroyer. It's suicide. Why don't we wait for more fighters from the New Republic ships? I think that would be by far the safest strategy. Chewbacca snarled, and 3PO decided it was unwise to press the point any further. A combat wing of TIE fighters soared past them, firing bursts from their laser cannons. One of the assault shuttles passed into the crossfire, and as 3PO reconstructed the images an instant later, he determined that it received 8 direct hits within 2 seconds. Its shields failed, hull plates buckled, and the shuttle exploded as the TIE fighters soared past to face the X-Wings and Y-Wings pouring from the New Republic battleships. Chewbacca let out a grief-stricken roar at seeing some of his newly rescued friends die. The cry was echoed across the comm system by the other Wookiees. With the explosion, 3PO experienced a sudden disorientation. He had been partially linked to the destroyed ship. He felt as if a part of him had been disconnected. "Oh dear," he said, then shifted his concentration to managing the other shuttles. "Chewbacca, you have my complete support. We simply cannot allow them to do this sort of thing." Chewbacca roared agreement and gave 3PO a camaraderie slap on the back that practically sent the droid through the control panels. A tiny streak of light shot past them, and 3PO was able to freeze the image in his optical sensors. It was the angular, crystalline shape of a tiny 2-man ship. He recognized it instantly. "Oh my, isn't that the Sun Crusher?" 3PO asked. Preoccupied, Chewbacca roared a challenge as the 4 remaining assault shuttles cruised low over the Gorgon's starboard side. They soared above the complex topography of the hull, a blur of indecipherable outcroppings, piping, fuel shafts, portholes, and life support equipment. Dalla's heavy turbolasers shot alternately at the Maw installation and at the New Republic starfighters. 7 TIE fighters broke away from the main attack and circled back to head off Chewbacca's squadron. But the Wookiees unleashed a smoking volley from the assault shuttle's heavy blaster cannons. Stunted old Nalron and several other Wookiees sat in the gunner seats and fired relentlessly. A web of blaster bolts spewed from the shuttles, clipping 4 of the attacking TIE fighters. 2 others veered wildly away from the sudden firepower and careened into the side of the Gorgon. The lone survivor of the attack group peeled off and fled to get reinforcements. Chewbacca grunted in satisfaction. The assault shuttles hammered the Star Destroyer's turbolaser batteries as they streaked back and forth, launching their store of concussion missiles. With the smoldering eruptions of hull plates and exploding weapon systems, the Gorgon was defenseless on one side. "Oh, well done, Chewbacca!" 3PO cried. "You did it!" Chewbacca purred in satisfaction. Loud, triumphant roars came from the back of the assault shuttle in the gunner bay, but as TIE reinforcements arrowed toward them, 3PO decided it was time to cease the frivolity. "Excuse me, sir," he said, "but hadn't we better retreat now?" Like a master pilot, Kip Duron brought the Sun Crusher into the berth on one of the planetoids. He maneuvered the thorn-shaped ship through the blast doors and into the bay. Luke let the young man pilot as he himself worked the communication systems, transmitting to the escort frigate and then to the installation operations center. "Wedge, are you there? Are you all right? Tell me what's going on. This is Luke." A response came over the comm, accompanied by a cacophony of alarms and shouted orders, status reports, and the background rumble of direct hits from the Star Destroyer. "Luke, you're alive! What are you doing here?" He realized that Wedge had been inside the Maw cluster since before the defeat of Exar Kun. "We brought the Sun Crusher here to destroy it, but it looks like you're having problems of your own." "I'd need a few hours to tell you everything that's happened since this operation started," Wedge said. His voice was harried. "Are you safe?" "We're fine for now, Wedge. We're landing in one of your maintenance bays." "Good. I can use whatever help you can offer." After Kip secured the Sun Crusher, he popped open the hatch, and the 2 of them clambered down the metal ladder. They set off at a brisk jog through the curving corridors that tunneled through the dead rock. The rhythmic pounding of Dalla's repeated blasts echoed through the tunnels. The 2 of them spilled into the operations center, trying to make sense of the frenzy of preparations Wedge had underway. Wedge Antilles ran forward to embrace his friend. Both men clapped each other in the back. "I'm so glad you're with us," Wedge said in a voice filled with unasked questions. Then he flashed a distrustful gaze at Kip Duron, who stood contritely on the threshold. "What's he doing here?" Beside him, Queezux also saw him and gasped, taking a step backward. "I'm sorry," Kip said quietly. Luke looked sternly at Wedge. Kip is here to help us, Wedge. He has returned from the dark side, and I've made my peace with him. If you still hold a grudge, then take it up with him once this is all over. Wedge looked at Quee, and her gentle, narrow face tightened before she nodded briefly. Kip came here to destroy the Sun Crusher as a form of penance, but now... Luke gripped his apprentice's shoulder. Now, we are two Jedi offering our services in this fight. Wedge called to one of the other commandos. Give me a status update now, he said. The tactical crew rattled off a list of starfighters deployed, shots fired, a tally of enemy and ally losses. Chewbacca's team appears to have knocked out the Gorgon's starboard turbo laser batteries. Wedge looked relieved. If only we can keep damaging Dala faster than she can damage us. He shook his head. Where's Han? Luke asked. Kip perked up, eagerly awaiting the answer. Wedge frowned. What do you mean? Luke explained about the prototype and how Han, Lando, and Mara Jade had last been seen inside its superstructure. Wedge shook his head. The Sun Crusher and the Gorgon are already here. Now you're telling me the Death Star is coming back? He blinked in disbelief before starting to snap out orders to the tactical team. You heard what Luke said. Looks like we got another surprise coming our way. It didn't seem possible, but everyone managed to bustle a little faster. Luke stared through the broad skylights of the operations center. He sensed it before he saw it. Through the flaring lights of battle overhead and the muffled din of repeated explosions, the armillary sphere of the Death Star prototype emerged through the pastel glow of the maw and entered the fray. 36. The Millennium Falcon's landing claw clung to the Death Star's superstructure as the skeletal sphere lurched into motion again and careened through the black hole cluster. Han, Mara, and Lando sat strapped into their swiveling seats, gritting their teeth from gravity's onslaught. The Falcon held on, but the prototype bucked from the enormous tidal pulls. Once the rough passage was over, Han scanned the diagnostics. Gotta do something about those hyperdrives, he said. If we fly fast enough, we could just blow the reactor core and run. But the way the Falcon's limping along, we'd never get away in time. Han turned his seat to look at Lando and Mara. He wiped dark hair away from his eyes. And even if we do get away in time, we'd never make it back through the maw cluster without top-notch maneuverability. Not to mention we don't know the way out, Mara said. My Jedi instincts aren't strong enough for a job like that. Now that's another good point, Han admitted. But Han, Lando said, we've got to do something. If the Death Stars come back to Maw installation, it's bound to be up to no good. Yeah, Han said, nodding grimly. Chewie's in here with the rest of the occupation force. I won't just leave him if he's in trouble. Mara pulled herself to her feet. So it's obvious, she said. We've got to deactivate that super laser. She shrugged. As long as we're here. But the hyperdrive engines, Han began. You got environment suits, don't you? She said. A light freighter like the Falcon ought to have at least a couple for emergency repairs. Yes, Han said, drawing out the words, still unable to guess what Mara had in mind. I've got 2 suits, one for me and one for Chewie. Good, Mara said, cracking her knuckles. Calrissian and I will go out and plant time detonators on the reactor core. You work on the hyperdrive engines. The timers will let us get out of the superstructure before they blow. Lando's mouth dropped open. You want me? Her eyes challenged him. Got any better ideas? He shrugged and grinned. Why, no. I'd be honored to escort you, Mara. Lando sneezed as he tugged on the huge padded suit. This whole thing smells like Wookiee hair, he said. Did Chewbacca exercise in this thing and put it away wet? The sleeves were enormous, and his feet swam in the Wookiee-sized boots. He tugged the bulky fabric around his waist, fold upon fold, and then used the adjustment straps to cinch it tighter around him. He felt as if he were walking inside a giant inflated mattress. We've got a job to do, Calrissian, Mara said. Quit complaining, or I'll do it myself. No, Lando said. I want to help you. Really. Here. Mara held out a case of the time detonators. Carry these. Lando looked down at them and swallowed. Thanks. Han gave a hollow grunt of pain as he bumped his head on something down in the repair crawl space. Lando heard his friend mutter something about wishing for a decent droid to do the dirty work. A couple of the components are fried, Han called up to them. His voice sounded tinny through the compartment. But I got spares, or at least close enough that I can get the ship running again. We got 3 fused circuits. 1 we can get by without. 2 I can bypass. We'll give you half an hour, Mara said, pulling the helmet on and sealing it over her neck. Han repositioned himself in the coffin-sized maintenance bay to stick his head above the deck plates. Grease and leaked coolant stained his cheeks. I'll be ready. You better be if we trigger those timers, Lando said, and secured his own helmet. It seemed as large as a shuttlecraft on his head. Come on, Calrissian, Mara said. We've got some wrecking to do. From his comfortable chair, Tol Siverin squinted out at the panorama of the Maw's center, assessing the situation but making no decisions, like a good manager. It's the Star Destroyer Gorgon, sir, the stormtrooper captain said. Shall I hail it? Siverin scowled. About time Admiral Dalla came back to do her duty, he said. It still rankled him that she had abandoned her primary mission of protecting the Maw scientists. Now that the rebels had already taken over the installation, it was too late for her to make amends. Why did she come back with only one Star Destroyer? Siverin said. She had 4. No, wait. One was destroyed, wasn't it? Well, 3 anyway. Now she simply wants to flaunt her weaponry? He sniffed. Well, this time we've got our own Death Star and we're not afraid to use it. Excuse me, Director, the captain said, but the Gorgon appears to be severely damaged. The rebel forces are attacking her. I believe it's our duty to come to her aid. Tol Siverin looked at the captain incredulously. You want us to rescue Admiral Dalla after she deserted us? You have an odd sense of obligation, Captain. But, the stormtrooper said, aren't we all fighting the same battle? Siverin frowned. In a sense, perhaps, but we must have different priorities, as Dalla herself evidenced by leaving us behind. He saw the rebel ships opening fire on the lone Star Destroyer, saw the attack increasing as starfighters met TIE fighters in a flurry of pinpoint laser strikes. The colorful battle had a hypnotic effect, and he thought of the blazing heat storms on the twilight homeworld of Ryloth. He felt a lump of comet ice form in his stomach. His career had been long and successful, but he was about to end it by destroying the facility he had so successfully administered for years and years. In the pilot chair, the Death Star prototype, Siverin said in a cold voice, All right, let us show Admiral Dalla we scientists can hold our own. Suddenly, an alarm ratcheted through the chamber. Siverin sighed. Now what? Yum and Dachshund both flipped through their manuals, searching for an explanation. We've detected intruders, the stormtrooper captain answered, on the power core itself. It seems we picked up one of those smuggler ships near Kessel. Well, what do they think they're doing? Siverin asked. According to our sensor cameras, 2 people have emerged from their ship and, as far as we can tell, are attempting some sort of sabotage. Siverin set up an alarm. Well, stop them! He snatched the manual out of Dachshund's hands and flipped through the pages. Use emergency procedure number. He continued to skim over the pages, squinting down at the bulleted lists, flipping a few more pages before tossing the book aside in disgust. Well, just use the correct procedure, Captain. Do something. We have only a few men and not much time, the captain said. I'll order 2 space troopers to suit up and take care of the intruders personally. Yes, yes, Siverin said, waving his clawed hand. Don't bother me with details. Just get the job done. Lando tilted the face shield of his enormous helmet back and forth, the better to see with, but the Wookiee-sized suit folded around him in strange and uncomfortable ways. He had to work twice as hard just to figure out where he was going. His magnetic boots clomped on the metal plating of the gigantic cylindrical power core. Tapered at one end like a spindle with a diamond-hard point, the core pressed against another contact point that rose from the south pole of the Death Star. Between the 2 points, starfire crackled as the charge built up. The skeleton of girders and access tubes, walled-off compartments, temporary quarters, and storerooms formed a giant cage around them. Linked catwalks spanned open spaces like a tangled net. Though the prototype was the size of a small moon, it held very little gravity. Lando had to work hard to keep his balance, letting his magnetic boots determine the direction down. We have to go closer to the energy pods, Mara said, her voice buzzing through the tiny earphone. Lando looked for a way to respond and finally figured out how to activate his own helmet microphone. Whatever you say. The sooner I get rid of these detonators, the happier I'll be. He sighed partly to himself, but also for Mara's benefit. He'd think destroying 1 Death Star in a man's lifetime would be enough. I prefer men who never settle for enough, Mara answered. Lando blinked, not sure how to take her comment. He allowed himself a broad grin. Holding out his gloved hand to steady Mara, Lando worked his way down the immense cylindrical core. He tilted his visor to shield himself from the glare pouring from the discharge at the contact points. Above them, the pronged disc of the Falcon clung to a thick girder. "Should be good enough here," Mara said, reaching out. "Give me the first detonator." Lando rummaged in the shielded container and withdrew one of the thick discs. Mara cradled it in her padded glove and bent down to fasten it to the metal hull. "We'll work our way around and place them on the perimeter," she said, pushing her thumb down on the synchronization button. The detonator lit up with 7 lights blinking slowly, like a heartbeat, waiting for final activation. "When they're all in place," Mara's voice said, "we'll give ourselves 20 standard minutes. That should be ample time to get back to the Falcon and get away." Without waiting for him to agree, Mara worked her way around the curving reactor core and turned to take a second detonator from him, planting it squarely against the plating. Lando felt the faint vibrations of the core throbbing against his magnetic boots. The stored power seemed to be restless, building, waiting to be unleashed. It seemed to take forever to traverse the circumference of the vast power core, planting the 7 detonators. When they returned to their starting point, Mara leaned closer so Lando could see her face through the curved faceplate. "Ready, Calrissian?" "Sure thing," Lando answered. She punched the activator button on the first device. All around the perimeter, the detonators winked blue as they began their countdown. "Back to the Falcon. Hurry," Mara said. Lando clomped after her. A movement caught his eye from the side of the bucket-sized helmet, and he turned his head just in time to see the blocky, armored suit of an Imperial space trooper. The enemy looked like a man-shaped AT-AT walker with reinforced joints on elbows and knees, heavy boots, and vibroblades like claws in his gloves. One slash and the space trooper could rip open Lando's suit, killing him with explosive decompression. The space trooper emerged from an access hatch in the framework above. He let the low-gravity cushion his fall as his bulk dropped onto the power core. His heavy boots clanged on the metal as he landed next to Lando and Mara. "Where did he come from?" Lando said, ducking as the space trooper lunged with the vibroblades in his gloves. Lando bent backward like a mucus tree in a gale. His magnetic boots held his feet in place, but he threw himself in the opposite direction. Vibroblades slashed past his chest. Mara reacted more swiftly, swinging the empty padded container that held the detonators, putting all her momentum behind it. The sharp-edged metal banged against the space trooper's thick helmet. The trooper reached up, stabbing through the plated case with vibroblade claws. Mara used her temporary disorientation to grab Lando and add his mass to her own as she shoved the space trooper. With her foot, Mara pried free one of the space trooper's boots as he fought to regain his balance. She slammed against him, breaking the magnetic grip of his other boot. In an instant, the trooper snapped free. Suddenly unattached to the core, he dropped with the momentum imparted by the force of Mara's counterattack. The space trooper scrambled to find purchase against the smooth cylindrical hull as he slid down toward the fiery contact points. The vibroblades in his glove made long silvery score marks on the metal, but did no good. Sucked inexorably down, the trooper plunged into the flaming discharge between the contact points and vaporized in a bolt of green and blue static. The detonators continued their countdown. Lando signaled, "We're on our way, Han, old buddy. Make sure you're ready to go." When he felt a vibration through his boots, Lando looked up to see another space trooper drop down from the catwalks. This one carried a blaster rifle, but Lando guessed the trooper dared not use it in the vicinity of the power core. The second trooper brought his blaster rifle to bear, motioning for them to surrender, but no voice came over their helmet radios. Lando wondered if the trooper had turned to a different frequency, or if he merely expected the blaster rifle to be a universal language. "Can he hear us?" Lando said. "Who knows? Distract him. Our time is running out." Lando waved his gloved hands and pointed down the expanse of metal to the blinking detonators. He flapped his palms frantically and threw his arms wide to mime an explosion. As the space trooper glanced in the other direction, Mara launched herself forward and grabbed the barrel of his blaster rifle, using it like a lever. In free fall, her own momentum knocked him free, sending the trooper tumbling back up toward the catwalks. "Let's go. Don't worry about him," Mara said, returning to Lando's side. "Get to the Falcon before those detonators blow." Mara and Lando toiled back to the ship, still clinging to the support girders. Behind them, the second space trooper managed to reach out and grab one of the tangled coolant pipes, stopping his reckless tumble. He descended toward the power core again, ignoring Lando and Mara as he hurried to the detonators. Lando felt Chewbacca's enormous baggy suit folding around him, making it difficult to walk. He looked back and saw the space trooper working with the detonators, but he knew Mara had cyberlocked them together. With only a few minutes left, the space trooper would be able to do nothing. Less than a minute before the timed detonation, Lando and Mara sealed themselves inside the Falcon just as Han disengaged the landing claw. "Glad you could join me," Han said, immediately punching the accelerators. The Falcon raced back out along the Death Star's equator. Its sublight engines flared white hot behind it. The surviving space trooper managed to reach the ring of detonators. He worked meticulously but rapidly, disconnecting each one, using the built-in laser welder in his suit to remove the explosives. He tossed each one, still blinking, into the open space. He succeeded in disarming 6 of the 7 detonators. He was standing right above the last one, prying it up, when it exploded beneath him. Outside, in the midst of the space battle, Admiral Dalla gritted her teeth. Her face wore a perpetual look of disdain as she stared at the dizzying firefight. The attack was not going well. Her forces were being gradually worn away. She hadn't had many TIE fighters to start with. Most of them had been left behind in the Cauldron Nebula when she had wheeled the Gorgon about to escape the exploding stars. She had only her reserves, and most of those squadrons had been wiped out by rebel starfighters. When the Death Star prototype reappeared among the gases overhead, Dalla felt a thrill of awe. She rejoiced at the enormous destructive potential suddenly available to her. The tide of the battle had turned. Now they could wipe out the rebel infestation. But when she determined that the prototype was piloted by the incompetent fool Tol Sivrin, her hopes dwindled. "Why doesn't he fire?" she said. "One blast and he could take out all 3 corvettes and the frigate. Why doesn't he fire?" Commander Kratos stood by her side. "I can't say, Admiral." She glared to make it clear she hadn't expected an answer. "Tol Sivrin has never had any initiative in his entire life," she said. "I should have known I couldn't expect him to do his duty now. Redouble our efforts against the installation. Let us show Tol Sivrin how it must be done." She narrowed her brilliant eyes to look around the bridge. "Enough practice," she said. "It's time to destroy Maw installation once and for all. Open fire!" 37. In the Maw installation operations room, one of the technicians pounded her fist on a control deck. "Shields are failing, General Antilles," she announced. Another engineer ran in from the outside corridor, florid-faced and puffing. Sweat plastered his hair to his forehead, and his blue eyes were glassy with panic. "All this pounding has knocked out the temporary cooling systems we installed on the reactor asteroid. It was never meant to withstand such punishment. The reactor's going to explode. No chance of patching it this time." Wedge gritted his teeth and looked to Quee. He squeezed her hand. "Looks like we're about to save Dalla the trouble," he said. "Time to evacuate." Beside him, Luke whirled around. "Hey, where's Kip?" But the young man was gone. "I don't know," Wedge answered, "but we don't have time to look for him now." Kip Duron's heart hammered, but he used a Jedi calming routine, forcing himself to relax. He required his bodily systems to operate efficiently, providing strength where he needed it, allowing neither fear nor exhaustion to hinder him. The tumult of alarms and external attack rattled the installation. New Republic soldiers ran across corridors, grabbing equipment and rushing back to their transports. No one stopped to look at Kip. If anyone had bothered to question him, he would have used a simple Jedi trick to distract them, blur their memories, making them believe they had never seen him. Kip was pleased that Master Skywalker had not noticed his departure. With the sudden appearance of the Death Star prototype and the continued pounding from the Gorgon, Kip had known what he must do. He also knew Master Skywalker would try to stop him, and Kip had no time for that. He had used his own powers, light side powers he fervently hoped, to distract everyone while he slipped out into the corridor. He had blanked his thoughts, his keyed-up emotions. Unless Master Skywalker made a directed effort to pinpoint him, Kip would go unnoticed in the chaos. As he ran, the tempo of the battle outside increased, and he knew that the installation would not last much longer. If the Death Star prototype managed even one shot, they would be annihilated in an instant. That was a primary threat at the moment. As he sprinted down the rocky tunnels to the maintenance bay where he had landed the Sun Crusher, he recalled when he and Han had fled through the spice mines at Kessel. The memory of Han brought a deep pang. The Death Star had reappeared in the center of the Maw, but Kip had seen no sign of the Millennium Falcon. Did that mean Han was dead, destroyed in his sabotage attempt? Kip had been cursed with impulsiveness, making his decisions and acting on them without thinking of the consequences. Right now, though, that was a strength. He had to fight against the New Republic's mortal enemies, and he could not ponder and debate the ultimate results of his actions. Kip knew he had a great deal to atone for. He had listened to the dark teachings of Exar Kun. He had struck down his teacher and Jedi Master. He had wiped clean the memories of Zux. He had stolen the Sun Crusher and obliterated entire star systems. He had caused the death of his brother Zeth. Now he would do all he could to rescue his friends, not only to salve his conscience, but because they deserved to live and continue the fight for freedom in the galaxy. Kip stared at the oily metallic texture of the Sun Crusher's faceted sides. The quantum armor reflected light in strange directions, distorting it, making the superweapon appear to have been polished with low light. With trembling hands, he gripped the rungs of the ladder and ascended. Han Solo and Chewbacca had climbed these same rungs to get into the Sun Crusher during their escape from the installation. Kip's brother had attempted to pull himself aboard before Caradia's star exploded, but Zeth had not succeeded. Kip swung shut the hatch as if he were sealing himself off from the rest of the galaxy for all time. He didn't know if he would ever see the outside again, if he would ever return to Coruscant, or if he would ever speak to Han Solo or Master Skywalker again. He slumped into the pilot's seat and stilled those thoughts with a Jedi technique. Only a few hours earlier, he and Luke had been riding in the Sun Crusher, peaceful companions talking about their lives and their hopes. Now Kip could not think beyond working the simple controls of the Sun Crusher. He raised the spike-shaped craft on its repulsor lifts and guided himself through the long launching tunnel into open space where the battle raged. He approached the giant framework sphere of the Death Star. Kip had seen the effectiveness of the Sun Crusher's ultra-strong armor when Han Solo had flown at high speed through the bridge tower of the Hydra, but even the quantum armor could not possibly withstand a blast from the Death Star's super laser. Kip had 2 remaining resonance torpedoes that could trigger a supernova. He doubted he could get a critical mass in the prototype's skeletal structure, but a direct hit would still cause a substantial chain reaction. He accelerated forward, a mere pinprick on the vast canvas of garish-colored glasses around the Maw's black holes. Then, without warning, a bright flower of orange and white erupted from the power core at the center of the Death Star, a small explosion. An instant later, flying in the opposite direction, the Millennium Falcon blasted out of the superstructure, gaining speed. With a warm, melting sensation of relief and triumph, he knew that Han Solo had survived. Now Kip could strike the crippled Death Star with no second thoughts. And then he would go after Dala. He powered up his targeting and weapon systems. With Jedi senses, Kip could feel the power surging beneath him in the toroidal torpedo generator, energy sufficient to crack open stars. For one last time, he had to use it. The explosion in the power core sent the entire Death Star reeling off its axis. The lone space trooper attempting to disarm the detonators was hurled backward, already torn to shreds of plasteel armor and incinerated bone. The detonator had ripped open a gash in the cylindrical core, splitting the armored plating wide and spraying a jet of radioactive fire. Tol Siverin's headtails stretched out straight with outrage. "I ordered those 2 space troopers to stop the sabotage." He whirled to the Deveronian division leader. "Yem, record their service numbers and make a special disciplinary notation in their files." He tapped his claws on the chair arm and finally remembered to say, "Oh, and give me a damage assessment." Doxson ran to the status council and pulled up a visual. "From what I know of the blueprints, Director, there appears to be a relatively insignificant breach in the power core. We can repair it before radiation levels get too high. It's a good thing no more than one of those detonators blew, though. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to contain it." The stormtrooper captain was on his feet, chattering orders into his radio helmet. "I've already sent a full squadron of troopers down to suit up, sir. I've instructed them that their personal safety is forfeit." Good, Tol Siverin said absently. "How soon will I be able to shoot again?" The stormtrooper studied his panels. The white plasteel helmet masked any hint of expression. "The stormtroopers are suited up and on their way. They are descending the catwalks now." He pointed his featureless black goggles at Siverin. "If the repair work goes as planned, you could fire within 20 minutes. "Well, tell them to hurry," Siverin said. "If Dala destroys Ma installation before I do, I'll be very annoyed." "Yes, Director," the captain said. Tol Sivrin watched with simmering frustration as the Millennium Falcon disappeared toward the other fighting ships inside the maw. He noticed the New Republic battleships that had overrun his facility. He noticed the large conglomeration of planetoids where he had spent so many years of his career. And then he looked at Admiral Dalla's Star Destroyer. Dalla, whom he loathed, who had deserted him in her duty at the time of greatest need. Tol Sivrin muttered to himself as he fidgeted in the command chair. So many targets, he said, and so little time. 38. The battle-scarred Star Destroyer cruised so low over the Maw installation's weakening defense shields that Luke's instinct was to duck. The complex clutter of the Gorgon's hull flowed like an unending river past the skylights, showing just how immense the battleship was. Shields just failed completely, one of the technicians said. We won't survive another pass, and the reactor asteroid's going critical. Wedge punched the facility-wide intercom and shouted orders. His voice echoed through the labyrinth of tunnels and the clustered asteroids of the installation. Last call for evacuation. Everyone to the transport ships. Now! We've only got a few minutes to get out of here. The alarm somehow grew even louder. Luke turned to follow the troops running toward the doors. Wedge grabbed the thin blue arm of Queezux, but she resisted, staring in horror at the computer screens. Look, she said. What is she doing? She can't. Wedge stopped to glance at the streams of data flying across the screens at high speed. He blinked and saw rapid-fire images of blueprints, weapons designs, test data. Admiral Dalla must have known Director Sivrin's password, Quee cried. She's dumping the data backups we couldn't crack. She's downloading all the weapons information. Wedge grabbed Quee by the waist and yanked her away from the terminal, rushing her toward the door. We can't do anything about that now. We've got to get out of here. They ran down the corridors with the assault troops in the lead. Quee's feathery hair streamed behind her, glinting in the harsh white light from the glow panels. Wedge felt overwhelmed, his tension rising, as if his internal chronometer were ticking down the seconds until the explosion of the fragile reactor asteroid, until Admiral Dalla's next attack, until the whole installation bloomed into a white-hot cloud of rubble. Wedge had never wanted to be a general anyway. He was a good wingman, a fighter pilot. He had flown beside Luke down the trench of the first Death Star, and next to Lando Calrissian to destroy the second one. By far, the best assignment had been to escort the lovely Queezux. Even frightened and dismayed, Quee looked exotic and beautiful. He wanted to hold her and comfort her. But he could do that on the transport back to the Yavaris. If they didn't get out of here immediately, they would all die. As the refugees scrambled across the takeoff area, one of the transports declared itself fully loaded. Wedge grabbed his comlink. Go, go! Don't wait for us! They charged up the ramp of another waiting shuttle. The remaining troops scattered to their seats. Wedge took a second to make sure Quee had a safe place to strap herself in. Luke bolted for the cockpit and threw himself into the co-pilot's chair, powering up the sublight engines. Wedge took one last glance back at the personnel compartment to verify that everyone is at least close to being seated. Secure the door, he cried. One of the lieutenants slammed a palm against the hatch controls. With an impatient hiss, the ramp drew in like a retracting serpent's tongue. The doors clamped shut. Wedge wasted no time securing himself into his seat before raising the transport off the landing pad. With a scream of acceleration, the troop ship launched itself away from the dying Maw installation. The bootsteps of Commander Kratos sounded like hammers on sheet metal as he ran up to the bridge observation platform. Admiral Dalla turned, anxiously awaiting a favorable report. Kratos tried to regain his composure, but did not succeed in wiping the idiotic grin from his lips. Transfer successful, Admiral. Complete core dump of all the Maw's backup computer files. He lowered his voice. You were correct. Director Sivrin did never bother to change his password. He was still using the same one you obtained 10 years ago. Dalla snorted. Sivrin has been incompetent in everything else. Why should he change now? Most of their TIE fighters had been wiped out. None of her starboard turbolasers were functional. Engines operated at only 40% efficiency, and many systems were severely overheating. She had never anticipated the battle would take this long. She had meant to obliterate the rebel forces and then finish mop-up operations at her leisure. She didn't understand why Sivrin and his Death Star didn't do anything. But finally, something had gone right. She had retrieved the precious data from the Maw installation computers. Dalla watched as the troop transports fled the cluster of rocks below, but she deemed them insignificant targets. Installation shields are completely down, the tactical lieutenant said. Good, she snapped. Wheel about. We'll make a final attack run. Excuse me, Admiral, Kratos interrupted. We're getting anomalous readings from the reactor asteroid. It appears to have suffered severe damage and is highly unstable. Dalla brightened. Ah, excellent. We'll target that. Perhaps the reactor can do most of the destructive work for us. She looked out the bridge tower and saw the ocean of screaming gases around the infinitely black pinpoints. The Gorgon turned about and headed toward Maw installation. Full ahead, Dalla said, standing rigid at her station, gloved hands clasped behind her back. Her coppery hair flowed behind her like spraying lava. Fire repeatedly until the installation is destroyed, or until our turbolaser banks are drained dry. The lumbering ship picked up momentum as the Gorgon accelerated forward on its final run. Wedge flicked on the open communications unit to contact the New Republic fleet. He didn't care about encryption at the moment. If the Imperial forces could decode his transmissions, they wouldn't have time to take action anyway. All fighters, regroup and return to the Yavaris. Prepare to retreat. We are leaving the Maw. We have everything we came for. The huge frigate hung like a jagged weapon waiting to receive the fighter squadrons. X-Wings and Y-Wings looped around, disengaging from space dogfights and heading back to their primary ships. Wedge accelerated toward the Yavaris. The squarish opening in the frigate's lower bays glowed with an atmosphere containment field, like a welcoming open door. Without warning, 4 square-winged TIE fighters shot up from Wedge's blind spot, mercilessly battering the front of the transport shuttle with laser bolts. Before Wedge could react, an assault shuttle bearing Imperial markings flew in from the left, firing multiple beams from its forward heavy blaster cannons. The attack took the pilots by surprise. They scrambled and scattered. 2 careened into each other to get out of the way. 2 others succumbed to the focused blasts, exploding into molten debris. Wedge heard a loud Wookiee roar of triumph over the open comm channel, echoed by growls and shouts from the assault shuttle's passenger compartment. The clipped metallic voice of C-3PO interrupted. Chewbacca, please do stop showing off. We need to get back to the Yavaris. Luke toggled the communications panel. Thanks, guys. Master Luke, 3PO cried. What are you doing here? We need to get away. It's a long story, 3PO. We're doing our best to do just that. On the opposite side of the Maw, the Gorgon spun about and accelerated toward the unprotected installation like a wild bantha, its rear engines blazing with starfire. A flurry of green turbolaser bolts blurred out from the Star Destroyer's fore section, angling down to strike the installation's clustered asteroids. With the facility's shields down, ionized rock dust sprayed into space. Dalla fired and fired again, picking up speed in what appeared to be a suicide run. Her strafing beams pummeled this installation, striking asteroid after asteroid. Metal bridges vaporized, transparent steel shattered and blew outward. The Gorgon came on, unstoppable until, just as she soared over at the closest approach, the attack breached the containment housing the unstable power reactor. Sitting in the cockpit of the personnel transport, Wedge and Luke both flinched as the entire Maw installation suddenly became a blaze of light, like a miniature exploding star. The center of the Maw was filled with an incandescent, purifying fire. The glare flooded outward, automatically causing the view screens to darken. Wedge flew blind, trusting the navigation computer's controls and aiming toward the waiting New Republic flagships. When his vision finally cleared, he looked back to the stable point that had held the Emperor's most sophisticated weapons research laboratory. He saw only a far-flung swarm of broken rocks and smoldering gases and an expanding backwash of energy. Eventually, the debris would drift far enough to be siphoned down to infinity through one of the black holes. As the glare faded and the fiery gases cleared, he saw no sign whatsoever of Admiral Dalla or her last Star Destroyer. 39. Working like automatons, the team of doomed space troopers attached themselves to the breached wall of the Death Star's power core. Intense radiation spewed out, darkening their faceplates so they could barely see, slowly frying their life support systems. Moving sluggishly as they weakened under the invisible onslaught, they wrestled thick sheets of plating in the low gravity. They used rapid laser welders to slap patches over the breach, reinforcing it to withstand an energy buildup. One of the space troopers, his control pack sparking with blue lightning as the suit's controls all broke down, thrashed about in eerie silence. His arm movements gradually slowed until he drifted free. One of the others took his place, ignoring the lost companion. Every one of them had already received a lethal dose of radiation. They knew it, but their training had been thorough. They lived to serve the Empire. One of the troopers completed a last weld at the hottest point of the breach. His skin blistered, his nerves were deadened, his eyes and lungs hemorrhaged blood, but he forced himself to finish his task. The cold vacuum of space solidified the welds instantly. With a gurgling voice filled with fluid, the space trooper gasped into his helmet radio. Mission accomplished. Then the remaining troopers, with failing life support systems and bodies already savaged by the fatal radiation, released their hold on the power core in unison. They drifted free, dropping toward the brilliant energy discharge like shooting stars. At the total destruction of Maw installation and the loss of Admiral Dalla's Gorgon, Tol Siverin's initial reaction was one of annoyance and disappointment. The installation was supposed to be my target, he said. He glared at his other division leaders. How could Dalla do such a thing? I have the Death Star. She doesn't. As the shockwaves and light echoes from the huge explosion drifted and faded, Siverin could see the rebel fleet gathering itself to flee the cluster. Siverin sighed. Perhaps we should hold another meeting to discuss options. Sir! The stormtrooper captain got to his feet. Our reactor is now temporarily repaired. I lost 9 good space troopers to bring the weapon back online. I think we should use it. The rebel fleet is in retreat. We'll lose them if we don't act soon. I know this is non-standard procedure, Director, but we have no time for a meeting. Siverin looked from side to side, suddenly insecure. He didn't like to be pushed into snap decisions. Too many things could go wrong if one did not consider the full consequences. But the captain had a good point. All right, then. Temporary emergency actions. Ad hoc committee decision. Shall we use the super laser to strike at the rebel forces? Doxson, your vote? I agree, the squat division leader said. Tol Siverin turned to the hatcheted-faced woman. Golanda, let's cause some damage. Yum. The Deveronian nodded, his horns bobbing up and down. It will look much better in the report if we have a unanimous vote. Siverin considered. Since Werman is no longer with us, I will act as his proxy and cast my vote along with his. Therefore, the vote is unanimous. We will strike the rebel forces. He nodded to Yem. Please note that in the minutes. Director, the stormtrooper captain interrupted. The rebel fleet is pulling out. One of the corvettes has already gone into the maw. Captain, you are so impatient, Siverin snapped. Can't you see we've already made the resolution? Now it's time to implement it. Go ahead and establish your first target. He blinked his tiny eyes and spotted one of the Corellian corvettes hanging dead in space. What about that one? Siverin said. It appears to be either crippled or booby-trapped. I don't like it. And besides, it's a stationary target. We can use it to calibrate our aiming mechanisms, since you missed a whole planet last time. As you wish, Director. The stormtrooper relayed the instructions to the team of gunners in the firing bay. I suggest we fire at only half strength, Director, Doxson said, scanning the technical readouts. His bald skull furrowed again. Even at reduced power, the Death Star super laser will be more than adequate to destroy a simple battleship. In that way, we can manage multiple firings without depleting our reservoir so quickly. We won't have to wait so long between shots. Good suggestion, Division Leader, Siverin said with a smile of anticipation. I'd very much like to shoot more than once. Down in the firing bay, the gunners hunched over sprawling control banks, fingers moving deftly over the arrays of brightly lit squares to call up the targeting cross and lock in on the doomed corvette. Hurry up and fire, Tol Siverin's voice echoed through the speakers. We want to get a second shot at those ships before they all leave. Together, the gunners focused the secondary laser beams and yanked back on the levers to release the pent-up energy within the power core. Along the focusing tubes, a wide beam of incinerating power shot out. It funneled through the focusing eye and blazed into a deadly spear, striking precisely on target. The crippled Corellian corvette was so insignificant that it absorbed little of the destructive power. The beam went through the vaporized wreckage and continued into the curtains of the maw. Outstanding, Siverin said. See what happens when you follow the correct procedures? Now target the frigate, the big ship. I want to see that one explode. We have enough energy reserves for several more blasts, the stormtrooper captain said. Then a tiny, angular blip of light streaked across their targeting viewport, as seemingly insignificant as a gnat, yet it kept coming. Its hull glistened brightly in reflected light. The small ship fired its ridiculously ineffective defensive lasers at the Death Star. "What's that?" Severin said. "Give me a close-up." Golanda magnified the image on the screen and scowled. Her face looked unpleasant enough to shatter planets. "I believe it's one of our own concepts, Director Sivrim. You may recognize it yourself." As he looked at the shard-shaped vessel, his head-tails twitched. Of course he remembered it, not only from the working model he had seen once, but from all the progress reports and computer simulations its creator, Queezux, had delivered during her years of development. "The Sun Crusher," he said. "But that's ours!" The torus-shaped resonance field generator glowed with plasma fire at the bottom of its long spike. "Open a channel," Tol Sivrin said. "I want to talk to whoever is there. Hello? Hello? You've appropriated property that belongs to Ma Installation. I demand that you return it to the proper Imperial authorities immediately." He crossed his arms over his chest and waited for a reply. The pilot of the Sun Crusher answered by launching one of the supernova torpedoes into the Death Star. Kip felt a rush of satisfaction as he pressed the firing button, ignoring the Twi'lek administrator's pompous posturing. He watched the high-energy projectile shoot from the bottom of the Sun Crusher and burrow deep within the complicated framework of metal girders inside the prototype. The resonance torpedo vaporized girders as it tunneled deeper and deeper until it finally struck heavier primary struts that foamed as they disintegrated. The torpedo dumped its energy in a shower that triggered a small chain reaction within the solid superstructure, splitting atomic nuclei and causing an arc of spreading dissolution. Girders vaporized in a widening hole that ate its way farther and farther through the heavy framework. But Kip's elation faded as the chain reaction slowed, and then stopped. The skeletal Death Star had insufficient mass to continue its own disintegration. He had ruined a good portion of the support framework in one sector of the prototype, but not enough. Kip powered up the weapons panel again and prepared to fire. He could annihilate the Death Star piece by piece if necessary, but looking down at his panel, he noted with dismay that only one of his supernova torpedoes remained. Grim-faced, Kip zoomed in closer to the prototype. He would have to make this last shot count. Wheeling the Millennium Falcon in a backward arc, Han Solo tried to check how much damage the detonators had done to the Death Star's power core. He was disappointed. He had expected to see the skeletal prototype bloom into a fantastic flower of fire, but instead the detonator seemed to have fizzled, leaving only a dimming blaze at the center. The ship drifted in space for a few moments as Mara and Lando shook to their environment suits. Lando rubbed sweat from his forehead and wiped his hands as if disgusted with the griminess of the suit. "Now what are we going to do?" Han asked when they had finally joined him back in the cockpit. Lando looked at the Death Star shrinking in the black distance behind them. "Maybe we better go see if Wedge—" Suddenly the Maw installation and the Gorgon were swallowed in a brilliant flare as everything detonated at once. "Too late," Mara said. "Now why couldn't the Death Star have exploded like that?" Lando said miserably. "Maybe we at least caused some permanent harm," Han said hopefully. But moments later they all groaned as a green beam lanced out from the Death Star to destroy one of the corvettes in the retreating New Republic fleet. "So much for permanent harm," Mara Jade said. "That Death Star's causing some harm big time," Lando said. "Wait," Han said as he glanced back at the Death Star, squinting. "Moving closer." "Closer?" Lando said. "You out of your mind?" "That's Kip," Han said, as the Sun Crusher streaked across the face of the Death Star and launched one of its static-filled torpedoes into the superstructure. "If he's taken on the Death Star, we gotta go help," Han said. The Sun Crusher fled toward the gravitational walls of the Maw cluster, and Tol Sivrin ordered the Death Star to track the small but deadly ship. "Get a lock on it," he said. "We'll blast it out of space the same way we did with that rebel ship." "Sir," the stormtrooper captain said, "to lock onto a target so tiny and moving so quickly—" "Then get close enough so you can't miss," Sivrin snapped. "One of his torpedoes ate up 11% of our superstructure. We can't afford more losses like that. How are we going to explain it when we get back to the Empire?" "Perhaps that would be a good reason to stay away from the Sun Crusher, sir," the stormtrooper pointed out. "Nonsense! How would that look on the report?" Sivrin said, leaning forward. "You have your orders, Captain." The equatorial propulsion units powered up and nudged the massive skeletal craft to greater speed as it pursued the flitting superweapon. "Fire whenever you have a target," Sivrin said. The Death Star picked up speed, and the tiny Sun Crusher slowed down as if taunting them. The gases grew hot in the outer shell of the maw as they approached one of the bottomless singularities. The Sun Crusher danced back and forth, shooting its tiny lasers, destroying minor struts here and there, causing insignificant damage. The Death Star had to fight against the gravity of the nearby black hole. "What's the matter?" Tolsiverin said to the gunners over the intercom. "Are you waiting to read the serial numbers on his engine parts?" The Death Star shot again. Its green beam tore through the outer wisps of the cluster, firing point blank at the Sun Crusher, but the laser curved to the left, tugged by the mighty force of the black hole. The green beam spiraled like a ball bearing falling into a drain. "You missed! How could you miss?" Tolsiverin ranted. "Captain, give me those flight controls. I'm going to pilot the Death Star myself. I'm tired of your incompetence." All the division leaders suddenly looked at Tolsiverin aghast. The stormtrooper captain turned slowly in his chair. "Are you sure that's wise, Director? You don't have the experience." Siverin crossed his arms over his chest. "I have read the procedure, and I've watched what you're doing. I know everything I need to know. Give me the controls right now. That's a managerial directive." Siverin grinned with anticipation as he began to issue commands directing the Death Star. "Now we'll finish this properly," he said. Just like a pet fluzum on a leash, thought Kip as he flew toward the black hole. The Death Star followed his every move. He reversed course and arrowed back toward the prototype, increasing speed and calling up his weapons controls. The maze of metal girders and cross braces spun below him, and he launched his last resonance torpedo. The blazing cloud of plasma chewed through the outer layers of the prototype as it plowed ever-widening circles of destruction. The last shot would make them panic. It wouldn't cripple the Death Star entirely, but merely crippling the prototype would never be enough. He had to go for the full victory. As the chain reaction initiated by his last torpedo petered out, Kip sped over the metallic horizon of the Death Star and raced for the Maw's nearest black hole. Kip used his onboard tactical systems to estimate the exact position of the event horizon, the point from which no ship, however powerful, could ever escape. He came closer and closer, and the Death Star howled after him. Han shouted into the comm systems. "Kip! Kip Duron! Answer me! Don't go so close! Watch out!" But he received no reply. Death Star and Sun Crusher were locked in mortal combat, paying no heed to outside distractions. The Death Star prototype orbited close to the black hole. The Sun Crusher danced from side to side, hammering with tiny laser blasts. "I think I know what he's doing," Han said with deep uneasiness. "The prototype has greater mass and a much larger volume. If Kip can lure it near the point of no return—" "Without getting sucked on himself," Lando said. "That's the catch, isn't it?" Han answered. The Death Star fired again, and the super laser beam curved around, bent even more severely in the deep gravity well, but this time the gunner had compensated. The blurred fringes of the beam actually struck the Sun Crusher and knocked it spinning out of control. Any other ship would have been vaporized instantly, but the quantum armor plating protected the superweapon. Just barely. Kip's propulsion systems were obviously damaged. The Sun Crusher struggled along on a tangential course, attempting to pull away from the event horizon. But it was too close, and gravity was too strong. It spiraled in a tight orbit, sinking deeper and deeper. The Death Star pilot couldn't resist making the final kill, and the prototype loomed closer. The Sun Crusher and the giant skeletal sphere orbited the black hole like the ends of a baton, speeding up. Only then did the Death Star pilot seem to realize his peril, and all equatorial thrusters kicked on at once, attempting to pull the prototype away. But the giant vessel had already crossed the edge of the black hole. The Sun Crusher could not achieve sufficient velocity to escape its tightening orbit either. It spiraled in the wake of the Death Star, with no hope of getting away. Han felt as if his chest were being torn apart by the tidal forces. "Kip!" he cried. A final streak of light shot away from the Sun Crusher, and then it was too late for the tiny superweapon. The Death Star prototype plunged into the thickening cascades of superhot gases that shrieked down into nothingness. The spherical prototype elongated like a great egg under the uneven gravitational stresses. The curved girders ripped apart, then were crushed into a cone that stretched into Black Hole's funnel. With a wink of brilliance, the tiny Sun Crusher followed its nemesis down into the black hole. Lando and Mara remained utterly silent. Han hung his head and squeezed his eyes shut. "Goodbye, Kip." It's a message cylinder, Mara said, identifying the small streak shot out by the sun crusher. We better get it quick, because it's falling through the black hole, too. Message cylinder? Han sat up, trying to find his enthusiasm. Okay, let's snag it before it's too late. The Falcon raced toward the event horizon. Lando and Mara worked together, wrestling to navigate the ship in the buckling jaws of gravity. They detected the metallic container, and Lando swooped in, launching on it with the tractor beam moments before the small message pod could fall over the brink of the gravitational pit. Got it, Lando said. All right, pull it inside and let's get out of here, Han said in a bleak voice. At least I can hear the last words Kip had to say. 40. Han and Lando both pulled on stiff gloves before they wrestled the Sun Crusher's message canister into the Falcon's common area. Deep cold had penetrated the canister, and as they brought it into the enclosed atmosphere, tendrils of frost grew like lacy ferns across its surface. The thin metal hull gleamed bright, splotched in places by electrostatic discharge from when the cylinder had been launched at high speed from the Sun Crusher. That's one heavy message, Lando said as they lugged the canister to a flat spot on the floor and set it down with a metallic thump on the deck plates. Little more than a meter long and less than half a meter wide, the message pod was used by the captain of a doomed ship to launch his last entry logs and to dump his computer cores and navigation records for later investigations. Han remembered Kip telling him that when the Coruscant scientists had stumbled upon the message canisters inside the Sun Crusher, they had panicked, thinking they had uncovered the dangerous supernova torpedoes, even though the cylinder was standard Imperial issue, and any smuggler or starfighter pilot should have recognized it immediately. On his rampages in the Cauldron Nebula and the Caradia system, Kip had left message cylinders to explain what he had done and why, so that no one would construe his actions as simple astronomical accidents. Han felt stunned and lethargic with sadness. His friend had been right, but only to a point. Kip Duron's agenda to destroy the Empire had used tactics as vicious as those of the Emperor's. Luke Skywalker had claimed the young man would redeem himself fully, but now Kip's potential as a great Jedi had been extinguished. Han could not question Kip's sacrifice, though. Kip had eliminated both the Death Star prototype and the Sun Crusher. He had bought the galaxy's freedom from terror at the cost of his life. One life for potentially billions. That made sense, didn't it? Didn't it? Mara Jade knelt beside the message cylinder, running her slender hands over its hull. She popped open the access plate. Well, it's not encrypted, she said. Either Kip didn't have time or he knew we'd be the ones to pick it up. He left the homing beacon off. Just open it, Han said roughly. He'd had enough of this grim waiting. What had Kip thought to say in his last moments? Mara punched in the standard sequence. The lights blinked red, then amber, then flashed green. With a hiss of escaping air, a formerly invisible seam appeared down the center of the pod. The long black line widened as the two halves split, opening up. Inside, looking waxen and emotionless as a statue, lay Kip Duron. His eyes were closed, his face drawn into an expression of intense, yet surprisingly peaceful, concentration. "Kip!" Han shouted. His voice cracked with astonished joy, yet he tried to hold back his hope. "Kip!" Somehow Kip had crammed himself inside the small volume of the message cylinder, a vessel barely large enough to hold a child. But Kip had managed to crush his legs, fold his arms until the bones snapped, press down on his rib cage until ribs cracked, compacting himself. Han leaned closer to the ashen face. "Is he alive? He's in some kind of Jedi trance." In his final desperation, Kip had somehow found the strength to use his Jedi pain-blocking techniques, his determination, and all the knowledge Luke had taught him, to do this to himself, as his only chance for survival. "He's slowed his functions almost to the point of suspended animations," Mara said. "He's in so deep that he might as well be dead." The message canister was airtight but had no life support systems, no air other than the small amount that had fit around his own broken body. "That's impossible," Lando said. "Let's get him out," Han said. "Careful." Han gently, meticulously pried the young man free of the tiny cylinder. As Lando and Mara helped him carry Kip to one of the narrow bunks, the young man's body sagged and flopped from grievously smashed bones, as if someone had crumpled him into a ball and then tossed him aside. "Oh, Kip," Han said. As he set Kip on the bunk and straightened his arms, Han could feel the shattered wrists like jelly under his skin. "We have to get him to a medical center," he said. "I've got first aid here, but not nearly enough for something like this." Kip's black eyes fluttered open, glazed and unfocused with incredible pain, but he drove it back. "Han," he said in a voice as faint as beating wings. "You came to get me." "Of course, kid," Han said, bending down. "What did you expect?" "The Death Star?" Kip asked. "Sucked down into a black hole, along with the Sun Crusher. They're both gone." Kip's entire body shuddered with relief. Good. He looked as if he were about to collapse back into unconsciousness, but then his eyes blinked again, brightened with a new confidence. "I'll be all right, you know." "I know you will be," Han answered. Only then did Kip succumb to the pain and allow himself to sink back into his Jedi trance. "Good to have you back, kid," Han whispered, then looked up to Mara and Lando. "Let's get him back to Coruscant." A Wookiee bellow split from the intercom system, and Han stood up straight, rushing back to the cockpit to see a battered Imperial Gamma assault shuttle hanging in space in front of the Falcon, its engines white-hot and ready to go. "Chewie!" Han shouted into the voice pickups, and the Wookiee responded with a roar. "What Chewbacca is saying," 3PO's voice translated unnecessarily, "is that if you would like to follow us out of the maw, we have the appropriate course programmed into our nav computer. I believe we were all anxious to go home." Han looked at Lando and Mara and smiled. "You're sure right about that, 3PO." 41. Inside the dining hall of the great temple, Sigil stood silent and firm, studiously showing no reaction to Akbar's insistence. Clad once again in his white admiral's uniform, Akbar leaned closer to Sigil. He placed his splayed hands firmly on the shoulders of her watery blue robe. She could feel the heavy musculature in his hands as he pressed down. She flinched, afraid of what he would demand of her. "You cannot surrender so easily, Ambassador," Akbar said. "I will not accept that this task is impossible until you prove to me it is impossible." Sigil felt small under the probing gaze of his large eyes. No human would recognize it, but she could see the effects of long-fought stress on his face, and the modeling of his dark orange color. Akbar's skin looked dry, and his lobes had sunk deeply into the sides of his head. The small tendrils around his mouth looked frayed and cracked. Since the terrible crash on the planet Vortex and his resulting disgrace, Akbar had lived with an enormous weight on his conscience. But now he had come back to himself, returning to serve his people in the New Republic with greater determination, and coming to speak with her on Yavin 4. "There have been no Jedi healers since the Great Purges," Sigil said. "Master Skywalker believes I possess some aptitude in this area, but I have had no appropriate training. I would be swimming in murky waters, uncertain of my course. I don't dare." "Nevertheless," Akbar interrupted sharply. He released her shoulders and stepped back so that his clean white uniform dazzled her eyes in the dimness of the Massassi Temple's dining hall. Dorsk 81 stepped into the chamber, looking surreptitiously at Akbar. His eyes widened as he recognized the commander of the New Republic fleet. The cloned alien muttered his apologies and backed out, flustered. But Akbar's gaze did not waver from Sigil. She raised her head to meet his stare, but waited for him to speak. "Please," Akbar said, "I beg you. Mon Mothma will die within days if you do nothing." "I made oaths to myself, both when I became an ambassador and when I arrived here to train as a Jedi," Sigil said, bowing her head with a sigh, "that I would do everything in my power to serve and to strengthen the New Republic." She looked down at her spatulate hands. "If Master Skywalker has faith in me, who am I to question his judgment?" she said. "Take me to your ship, Admiral. Let us go to Coruscant." In the former Imperial Palace, Sigil reviewed the situation with growing dread. Mon Mothma no longer remained conscious. The infestation of nano-destroyers filled her body, tearing her cells apart one by one. Without the life support systems that kept her lungs filling, her heart beating, her blood filtered, the human woman would have died 8 days earlier. Some council members had begun advising that she be allowed to die, that forcibly keeping Mon Mothma alive in such a state was a lingering torture. But upon hearing that one of Master Skywalker's new Jedi would come from Yavin 4 to attempt healing her, Chief of State Leia Organa Solo had insisted that they wait for this last chance, this slim hope. Arriving in Imperial City, Sigil was flanked by Akbar and Leia as they ushered her down corridors to the medical chambers, where Mon Mothma lay surrounded by the growing stench of death. Leia's dark gaze flicked from Mon Mothma to Sigil. Her human eyes glittered with gathering tears, and Sigil could sense her hope like a palpable substance. The smells of medicines, sterilization chemicals, and throbbing machines made her amphibious skin feel irritated and rubbery. She wanted to swim in the soothing waters of calamari, to wash the disturbing thoughts and poisons from her body. But Mon Mothma needed that purging even more than Sigil did. She stepped to Mon Mothma's bedside, leaving Leia and Akbar behind her. "You must realize that I know nothing specific about the healing powers of the Jedi," she said, as if offering an excuse. "I know even less about this living poison that is destroying her." She drew a deep breath of the tainted air. "Leave me alone with her. Mon Mothma and I will fight this together." She swallowed. "If we can." Murmuring warm wishes and reassurances, Akbar and Leia faded into the background. Sigil paid little attention to them as they departed. Her shimmering blue ambassadorial robes flowed around her like ethereal waves. She knelt to stare at Mon Mothma's motionless form. Reaching out with the Force, but at a loss for what exactly she was supposed to do, she tried to assess the scope of damage inside Mon Mothma's body. As she began to see deeper, the extent of the poison's ravages astounded her. She could not comprehend how Mon Mothma had managed to stay alive for so long. Uncertainty fluttered in Sigil's mind like gathering shadows. How could she possibly combat such a disease? She did not understand how working with the Force could heal living things, how it could strengthen the life of someone so devastated as Mon Mothma. The best available medical droids had not been able to remove the malicious poison. No medicines had been able to cure her. Sigil knew only what Master Skywalker had taught her, how to sense with the Force, how to feel living things, how to move objects. She touched Mon Mothma with glowing currents of the Force, searching for some kind of answer, or at least an idea. Could she use her Jedi skills, but in a different manner that might strengthen Mon Mothma? Help her body to heal? Find some method to remove the poison? Sigil hesitated as a possibility struck like a meteor. The magnitude of the effort stunned her, and she wanted to dismiss the thought automatically, but she forced herself to study the idea. Master Skywalker had explained Yoda's teachings, his insistence that size matters not. Yoda had claimed that lifting Luke's entire X-Wing fighter was no different from lifting a pebble. But could Sigil turn it the other way around? Could she use her precise control of the Force to move something so small? She blinked her round calamarian eyes. Millions of the tiny nano-destroyers saturated Mon Mothma's body. Size matters not. But if Sigil could remove the destructive poison molecules, if she could somehow keep Mon Mothma from toppling over the abyss into death, then her body could restore itself. In time. Sigil refused to let her thoughts overwhelm her with visions of the sheer number of poison molecules. She would have to move them one by one, tugging each nano-destroyer through cell walls and out of the dying leader's body. Sigil placed her broad fins on Mon Mothma's bare skin. She picked up the leader's left hand and raised it over the side of the bed frame, letting the woman's fingertips rest in a small crystal dish that had once been used to dispense medications. Even this gentle touch was enough to cause red bruises to bloom on the woman's fragile skin. Sigil opened her mental doors, freeing her thoughts, allowing currents of the Force to flow into Mon Mothma's form. She let the necessitating membranes slide over her calamarian eyes as she began to see with an inner vision, traveling through the cellular pathways of Mon Mothma's body. She found herself in a strange universe of rushing blood cells, electrically firing neurons, contracting muscle fibers, laboring organs that could no longer perform their functions. Sigil couldn't exactly comprehend what she saw, but somehow she understood instinctively which parts were healthy, which molecules were sustaining Mon Mothma, and which were the Black Scourge. With the Force, Sigil could touch with fingers infinitely small, infinitely precise, to grasp one of the nano-destroyers and send it careening out of the dying body. Sigil found another microscopic destroyer and nudged them, pushed them, herding the poison away from healthy cells, preventing further damage. The task was incomprehensibly large. The poison had spread and replicated, scattering itself through the billions and billions of cells in Mon Mothma's body. Sigil would have to search and remove every one of them. After succeeding with the first one, Sigil sought out another, and another, and another, and another. "Has there been any change?" Leia whispered at the doorway. She had just returned from a meeting where General Wedge Antilles, Dr. Quizux, and Han Solo had given a detailed debriefing on the entire Maw assault. Leia had listened with fascination, making eyes at her husband Han, whom she had seen too little of in the past several days. But always in the back of her mind was a pressing concern for Mon Mothma. "No change," Akbar said in a tired voice. "I wish we understood what Sigil's attempting to do." The female Calamarian had not moved in 9 hours, kneeling beside Mon Mothma's bedside, flippered hands resting on the dying woman's skin, deep in a trance. The medical droids had not expected Mon Mothma to live for this long, so the mere fact that she still had not succumbed to death meant something. From outside the door, Leia peeked in to see that nothing had changed. The leader's hand lay in a crystal dish as droplets of an oily grayish liquid emerged from the tip of her index finger. The process was too slow to watch, but over the course of half an hour a small droplet would gather at the tip of her finger, dangling, until gradually gravity pulled it off into the dish. Turpin walked slowly down the tiled corridors dressed in a dark green, close-fitting uniform that bore no insignia. Even after his full pardon, Turpin had refused to accept his rank again. He had sequestered himself in his rooms for much of the time since returning from Anoth. The scarred Calamarian stopped several meters away from them, reluctant to go closer to the room that held Mon Mothma. Leia knew that Turpin still blamed himself for the dying woman's condition, and he refused to let the guilt be assuaged. Though she understood his misery, she was getting impatient with his withdrawal and hoped he would climb back to his feet soon. Turpin bowed ponderously, displaying the network of scars on his disfigured head. "Admiral, I have reached a decision." He drew a deep breath. "I wish to return to Calamari and continue your work, if our people will have me. I wish to assist in rebuilding Reefholm. I fear—" He looked up to stare at the intricate mosaics on the walls of the Imperial Palace. "I fear that I will never be comfortable on Coruscant again." "Believe me, Turpin," Akbar answered, "I know exactly how you feel. I would not try to talk you out of your decision. It is a fair compromise between your need for healing and your desire to make amends." Turpin straightened, as if some measure of self-esteem had been returned to him. "I would like to depart as soon as possible," he said. "I will arrange a ship," Akbar replied. Turpin bowed again. "If I have your leave, Chief of States?" "Yes, Turpin," Leia answered. She turned once again to watch the motionless tableau inside the medical chamber. At a forgotten hour in the depths of Coruscant's night, Sigil emerged from the medical chambers. She staggered, cradling in her right hand a shallow crystal bowl half filled with the deadly poison from the drink that Ambassador Fergan had thrown in Mon Mothma's face. The 2 New Republic guards stationed at the door snapped to attention and rushed to help Sigil. She was so exhausted she could hardly place one foot in front of another. She leaned against the stone doorway, drawing strength from the solidity of the rock. Her arm trembled as she extended the crystal dish to one of the guards. Sigil barely had enough strength remaining to lift the small poison-filled container, but she did not dare drop it. She felt a deep, bone-melting relief when the guard took it from her. "Be careful," she said in a husky, utterly exhausted voice. "Take this and incinerate it." The second guard scrambled to the intercom system and signaled for all council members to come immediately. "Do you have news of Mon Mothma?" the first guard asked her. "She has been cleansed, and she will heal." The lids dropped over Sigil's glassy eyes. But for now she must rest. Her flowing robes whispered against the tiled walls as she slid down to collapse on the floor. "As must I," she said, falling immediately into a Jedi recovery trance. 42. The Star Destroyer Gorgon limped through open space like a wounded dragon, leaking radiation from 1,000 damage points. Only one of the Gorgon's primary sublight engines still functioned. Admiral Dalla's engineers assured her it would be many days before they could attempt to enter hyperspace. Life support systems were down for the lower 12 decks, but Admiral Dalla's soldiers were accustomed to harsh and difficult conditions. Cramped living quarters might encourage them to make repairs faster. Heating systems were low, giving the air a frigid edge, making spoken words emerge from her lips accompanied by a plume of steam. Her precious flagship had been grievously wounded, Dalla knew, but she realized she did not need to make the Gorgon into a top-flight fighting machine again. Not any more. This time, she merely needed to complete sufficient repairs to crawl back to Imperial-controlled territory where she could start from scratch. Dalla's best advantage was that the rebel forces must have assumed her ship had been destroyed in the explosion. Their sensors would have been blinded in the eruption of the reactor asteroid. Watching Maw installation vaporize, Dalla had ordered full shields and full speed, throwing caution aside as she drove the Gorgon straight to the walls of the Maw, seeking her own way out. Now, crawling away from the energetic outbursts of the black hole cluster, the battered Imperial battlecruiser would not be noticed on any rebel scopes. Half the consoles on her bridge remained dim, unable to function after sustaining so many overloads. Technicians tore open access plates, bundled in heavy uniforms to keep warm, rubbing their numb hands together as they tinkered with electronics. But they did not complain, at least not while Dalla was watching. A significant percentage of her stormtroopers had been killed in sudden hull breaches or explosions below decks. The sick bays were filled with injured personnel. Many of the computer systems were offline, but they had survived. Commander Kratos stepped up to Dalla and saluted. His face looked devastated, smudged with grease and smoke from his attempts at hands-on repair work. "The news is not good, Admiral," he said. "I want to know our true status," Dalla said, forcing her concern back inside, where it could increase the pressure in her heart, crystallizing a diamond of her own resolve. "Tell me, no matter how bad it is." Kratos nodded, swallowing. "We have only 7 functional TIE fighters remaining in the hangar bays. All others were lost." "7!" she cried. "Out of—" She gritted her teeth and shook her head so that her hair whirled like an inferno around her face. She drew a short, controlled breath and nodded. "Yes. Continue." "We don't have sufficient spare parts to repair the damaged external weapon systems," he said. "Our starboard turbolaser batteries have been wrecked, but we may be able to get 2 guns functional again." Dalla tried to be optimistic. "That might be enough to defend ourselves if we are attacked, but we must hope not to encounter such a situation. We will not initiate any aggressive action at this point. Is that understood?" Kratos looked relieved. "Understood, Admiral. We can repair most of the hull breaches and repressurize some of the ducts, although, He hesitated, and his thick eyebrows knitted together like a giant furworm. "But I don't really see the point in that, Admiral," he finished. "We don't need those quarters, and it would only tax our resources at this point. Our repair crews are working around the clock, and I suggest we devote our efforts to completing only the systems critical to life support, and those necessary for us to be on our way." Dalla nodded slowly. "Again, I agree, Commander. It is a difficult decision, but we must be realistic. We have lost this battle, but the war continues. We will make no excuses for ourselves, but continue to give our best effort for the good of the Empire." She drew another controlled breath of the frosty air. Staring through the bridge viewport at the lush starfield that waited ahead, crossed by a wide swath like a milky river. Looking through the disk of the galaxy toward the dense core, she saw the stars appear to stream like a wide river. The Gorgon headed toward the luminous bulge of the galactic center. "Commander," she lowered her voice, "what is your opinion of the overall morale on the ship?" Kratos took a step closer so he could answer in a soft voice. "We have good people, Admiral, as you know. Well-trained and well-drilled, but they have repeatedly suffered grievous defeats." "Have they lost faith in me?" Dalla asked. Her face was chiseled in stone. She made herself strong and tried not to show that Kratos' answer could devastate her. She averted her emerald eyes, afraid that he might see something in them. "Absolutely not, Admiral," Kratos answered with a tinge of surprise. "They have the utmost confidence in you." She nodded to cover her long sigh of relief, then raised her voice, turning to the communications lieutenant. "Give me an open ship channel," she said. "I want to address all of our troops." Dalla gathered her thoughts until the lieutenant nodded to her. She spoke in a loud, firm voice that reverberated through the damaged ship. "Attention, all crew members of the Gorgon. I wish to commend you for your efforts against overwhelming odds, against a foe that continues to gain the upper hand through treachery and uncanny luck. We must now prepare for the next phase in this battle, however. We are making our way to the core systems, to the last strongholds that still swear loyalty to the Empire. It was not originally my intention to join with one of the Imperial warlords struggling for dominance, but it now appears that we must fight the larger fight. We need to convince them of their real enemy and show those still faithful to the Emperor that we must be united to be strong." She paused before raising her voice. "Yes, the Gorgon has been damaged. Yes, we have suffered severe losses. We have been wounded, but we will never be defeated. Trials such as these only strengthen us. Continue your efforts to make the Gorgon powerful again. Thank you for your service." She signaled to the communications lieutenant to stop the transmission. She looked out again at the moving stream of stars. The Gorgon's computer banks held all the information Dala had pulled from Maw Installation's classified computer banks. The weapons designs and the new concepts alone would help the Empire win the next phase of the war. As she stood on the cold bridge with gloved hands clasped behind her back, she watched the universe unfold in front of her. The Star Destroyer Gorgon sailed on toward the core systems. Through persistence, she would become victorious. One day. 43. The Lady Luck cruised low over the jagged surface of Kessel. Bleached sunlight washed across the alkali flats. The sky scintillated with intermittent streaks of light, flaming trails of meteorites, chunks of Kessel's destroyed moon burning down through the thin atmosphere. "You know, this is all kind of beautiful," Lando said, "in its own way." Beside him, in the space yacht's overly padded passenger seat, Mara Jade frowned skeptically. She looked at him as though she thought he was crazy. Not a new thought. "If you say so," she said. "Of course, it'll take a lot of work," Lando admitted, lifting one hand off the control so he could rest it on the arm of her chair. She flinched at his move. "But not too much. First order of business will be to get the atmosphere factories up to full capacity again. I'll have to bring in specially modified droids. I've already talked to Nien Nunb, my Celestin friend, who says he'd love to make his home down in those tunnels. I think he'll make a great crew boss." Lando raised his eyebrows and flashed her his most dazzling smile. "Defense will be difficult without the moon base, but I'm sure with the help of the Smugglers Alliance we can put together a great system. You and I will make quite a team, Mara. I'm really going to enjoy working closely with you." Mara sighed, but it was more of a resigned, tolerant noise than actual annoyance. "You just don't give up, do you, Calrissian?" He shook his head, still grinning. "Nope. Giving up is not my style. Not ever." Mara slumped back in her passenger chair and stared out the Lady Luck's front viewport. "I was afraid of that." Overhead in the white skies of Kessel, shooting stars continued to rain down. Two medical droids supported a recovering Mon Mothma. She stood dripping as she emerged from the Bacta tank. She wavered a little and held on to the smooth shoulder plates of the droids. Finally, she stood on her own again, took a deep breath, and lifted her head to smile. Leia stood watching, impressed at the rapid improvement. "I never thought I'd see you stand again, Mon Mothma." "Neither did I," the former chief of state admitted with a rueful shrug. "But my body is healing itself with a vengeance. The Bacta tanks are working overtime, effective again now that Sigil removed the nano-destroyers. I'm anxious to move about, to see all the things that happened while I was sick. I have a lot to catch up on. But the medical droids say I have to stay here and rest." Leia laughed. "You have plenty of time, don't worry. Do you—" She hesitated, not wanting to push Mon Mothma, but anxious to know. "Do you have any idea when you'll be ready to take back your duties as chief of state?" Assisted again by the droids, Mon Mothma toiled over to one of the padded seats near the Bacta tank. She slowly sank into the cushions. Still damp garments clung to her wasted body. She did not answer for a long time. When Mon Mothma looked up, her expression made Leia's heart skip a beat. "Leia, I am no longer chief of state. You are," she said. "I served well for many years, but this wasting illness has made me weak, not only physically, but also in the eyes of the New Republic. The New Republic must not waver in these trying times. Our leadership must be strong and dynamic. We need someone like you, Leia, daughter of the legendary Senator Bail Organa. My decision is firm. I won't attempt to regain my title. It's time for me to rest and recover with a great deal of thought on how best to serve the New Republic. Until such time as that changes, our future is in your hands." Leia swallowed and forced a comically stoic expression on her face. "I was afraid you were going to say that," she said. "But if I can handle a few Imperial renegades, I suppose I can keep the council members in line. After all, they're on our side." "You may find that the Imperials surrender a bit more readily than council members, Leia." Leia groaned. "You're probably right." The wind sang on the planet Vortex. Leia stared up at the newly rebuilt Cathedral of Winds, which rose like a gesture of defiance against the terrible storms. Beside her, Han kept blinking as the breezes stung his eyes, but he seemed awed by the tall structure. The new cathedral was different from what had been destroyed by Akbar's crash, more streamlined. The winged Vors had shown no interest in recreating their previous design, following a plan that seemed to flow from their collective alien minds. Crystal cylinders glittered in the sunlight, large and small tubes like a towering pipe organ. Notches in windows had been cut into the curved surfaces. The leathery winged Vors flew about, opening and closing the orifices to shape patterns of music as the winds whistled through. Everything else hunched low to the ground, but the Cathedral of Winds soared like the spirit of the New Republic. The impending storm rippled the thick carpet of purple, vermilion, and tan grasses that covered the plains. Low hummocks, underground Vor dwellings for the vicious storm season, lay in concentric rings round the pinnacles of the new cathedral. Leia and Han stood surrounded by a New Republic formal escort on a patch of grass packed down with polished squares of synthetic marble, laid out to form a low viewing stage. The Vors wheeled about in the air, flapping their wings and circling over the audience. The winged aliens had allowed no off-worlders to hear the concert of winds since the Emperor Palpatine had established his new order. But with the success of the rebellion, the Vors had finally permitted spectators again, not only representatives from the New Republic, but also dignitaries from a host of populated worlds. Leia's first attempt to come here with Akbar had ended in disaster, but she was certain that this time everything would turn out well. Han stood beside her, dressed in the diplomatic finery that he had obviously found uncomfortable, but she thought it made him look dashing. That seemed no consolation to her husband as he chafed under the rough and stiff formal dress. He must have sensed Leia looking at him, because he glanced down to give her a roguish smile. He snuggled closer, slipping an arm around her waist and pulling her tightly against him. The wind whipped around them. "Feels good to relax," he said, "and it's good to be here with you, Your Highness." "I'm chief of state now, General Solo," she said with a twinkle in her eyes. "Maybe I should order you to stay home more often." He laughed. "Think it would make any difference? You know how good I am at following rules." Leia smiled as the wind stirred her hair. "I suppose the two of us will just have to work out a compromise," she said. "Why does it seem as if the whole galaxy conspires to keep us away from each other all the time? We used to have adventures together." "Maybe it's payback for all the lucky breaks I've had," he said. "I hope your luck comes back soon, then." She snuggled against him. "Never quote me the odds." Han ran his fingers up and down her back, making her skin tingle. "I feel lucky enough right now." The wind picked up, and the hollow music lifted higher. Chewbacca's matted fur blew in all directions, making him look as if he had toweled off after a steam bath and forgotten to comb his body hair. He bellowed over the winds and the music of the cathedral. 3PO's tinny voice rang out. "Anakin! Jason and Jaina! Children, where are you? Oh, please do come back here. We're growing very worried." Chewbacca and 3PO waded through the thick grasses in search of the twins and their little brother. Anakin had crawled off to hide during the cathedral's opening ceremony. Distracted by the ethereal harmonies, none of the spectators had noticed the baby disappearing into the grasses, including Chewbacca and 3PO. Upon seeing their little brother missing, Jason and Jaina had both dashed out into the expansive fields, claiming they would help find baby Anakin, and of course, now all three children were lost. Chewbacca and 3PO tried not to cause too much of a distraction as they searched. "Jason and Jaina!" 3PO said. "Oh dear, what are we to do, Chewbacca? This is most embarrassing." They stumbled through thick rustling grass that rose to Chewbacca's chest. 3PO spread his golden arms to clear a path for himself. "This is scratching up my plating," he said. "I was never meant for a duty like this." Chewbacca cocked his head to listen, ignoring 3PO's complaints. He heard children giggling somewhere among the whispering grass blades. The Wookiee plunged through the thickets, swiping with his hairy paws to knock the blades out of his way. He found no one, only a trampled path from where he had heard the sounds. They would find them sooner or later. From behind him, swallowed up in the dense grass, he heard another thin voice. "Oh, Chewbacca, where have you gone? Now I'm lost." Standing on the polished mosaic platform of synthetic marble squares, Admiral Akbar held himself rigidly at attention beside white-robed Winter as the cathedral played its music. They sat among other off-world dignitaries and lavishly clad representatives from various planets. He had been reluctant to come for the christening ceremony, since he had accidentally destroyed the old Cathedral of Winds. He had feared the Vors might hold a grudge against him. But the Vors were a flat, emotionless race who seemed unaffected by individual events. They simply pushed on, recovering and striving to complete their plans. They had not censured the New Republic, had demanded no retribution. They had simply fallen to work reconstructing the Cathedral of Winds. The wind whistled cold around his exposed skin. The music sounded beautiful. Nearby, a lovely woman decked in jewels and bright primary colors clung to a haggard, weary-looking young man who slumped in his chair. Akbar glanced at them, then bent close to Winter, lowering his voice. "Could you tell me who those people are? I do not recognize them." Winter studied the pair, and her face took on a distant look, as if she was sifting through various files in her mind. "I believe that is the Duchess Mistal from Dargel and her consort." "I wonder why he appears to be so miserable," Akbar said. "Perhaps he is not a music lover," Winter suggested, then settled into an awkward silence. Finally, she spoke again. "I am glad you decided to return to the service of the New Republic, Akbar. You've given much to the future of our government." Akbar nodded solemnly, looking at the human woman who had served so many years as Leia's close personal aide. "I am pleased that you yourself have been freed from exile on Anath," he said. "I was concerned for you. Your personal talents and perceptiveness are greatly needed, and I have always valued your input." Akbar could see that Winter masked her expression carefully, allowing just a glimmer of a smile to show that she was holding back as much as she was. "Good then," Winter said. "We shall be seeing a great deal more of each other in times to come." Akbar nodded to her. "I would enjoy that." Queezooks listened longingly to the music of the winds. The notes rose higher, dipped lower, wove around themselves to form a complex, never-to-be-repeated melody, since the Vors forbade any recording of their storm concerts, and no two were ever alike. The flying creatures flitted up and down the shafts of crystal, opening hatchways, covering small holes with their hands or bodies as they shaped the symphony, building it as the storm grew closer. The music seemed to tell Quee's own life story. It struck her emotional chords, blowing through the hollows and crevices of her heart so that she heard the feelings she had experienced through her life. Her childhood loss, her agonized training, her brainwashed imprisonment for years in Maw installation, and her sudden thrill of freedom as she met members of the New Republic who helped her escape. Then Wedge Antilles, who had opened up more new worlds for her, bright dawns she had never before imagined. Now, after her time of healing, after she had returned to Maw installation and walked along the old corridors, set foot in her former laboratory, Quee no longer chose to mourn those lost memories. When the misguided Kipturon had erased her thoughts, it had been a violent act, but in hindsight she thought he might have inadvertently done her a great favor. She did not wish to remember her devastating weapons work. She felt as if she had been reborn, given a new chance to start a life with Wedge, unencumbered by dark thoughts of the deadly inventions she had helped to create. The music continued, hollow and mournful, then joyous and uplifting, in an eerie counterpoint like nothing she had ever experienced before. "Would you like to go back to Ithor with me?" Wedge bent close and whispered in her ear. "We can do our vacation right this time." Quee smiled back at him. The idea of returning to the lush jungle world sounded wonderful to her. The self-contained cities drifting over the treetops, and the peaceful alien people. The experience would do so much to ease the pain for the memories she had lost there. "You mean we're no longer having to hide from Imperial spies? From Admiral Dalla?" "We wouldn't have to worry about any of that," Wedge said. "We could concentrate entirely on enjoying ourselves." The Vors opened up all the hatchways and windows in the Cathedral of Winds. As the storm center hurled its greatest gales at the structure, the music built to a spiraling crescendo, a triumphant finale that seemed to echo throughout the galaxy. 44. Sunrise on the fourth moon of Yavin. R2-D2 trundled ahead up the flagstone ramp, chittering and bleeping as the new Jedi Knights followed him. In silence, they gathered atop the great temple to look across the mist-covered treetops. The orange gas giant glowed from behind as the system's sun came closer to the limb, suffusing the upper atmosphere with light. As the jungle moon continued in its headlong orbit, Luke Skywalker took his position in front of the procession to greet the coming dawn. Beside him walked young Kip Duron, still limping slightly from his newly healed injuries, but moving with an enormous inner strength. His entire attitude had changed in such a short time. But while Kip had been through the greatest ordeal of the new Jedi, Luke's other students had also proved themselves to be greater than he had foreseen, greater than he had hoped. Together they had overthrown Exar Kun, the Dark Lord of the Sith. Sigil had saved Mon Mothma's life with new techniques in Jedi healing. Streen had recovered his confidence and had shown remarkable adeptness at feeling and touching the weather. Tion continued her quest to resurrect Jedi history, a job made more difficult now that the Jedi holocron had been destroyed. But Luke knew there were other holocrons to be found, though they might have been lost over the millennia. Many of the ancient Jedi Masters had recorded their lives and their wisdom in such devices. Others, such as Dorsk 81, Cam Solusar, and Karana T, had not exhibited their particular aptitudes yet, though their powers were broad and strong. Some of the new Jedi would stay on Yavin 4 and continue to train and grow. Others would take their skills out to the galaxy as knights to defend the New Republic. R2 warbled an announcement, his prediction of when the first sunlight would strike the apex of the temple. The little droid seemed immensely pleased to be at Luke's side. Luke gathered his Jedi Knights around him, sensed their growing power intertwined. They were a team, not just wildcards with powers and abilities they did not understand. The others stood on the chipped flagstones of the observation platform, looking out toward the hidden sun. Luke tried to find words to express his growing pride and his high expectations. "You are the first of the new Jedi Knights," he said, raising his hands as if in a benediction. "You are the core of what will become a great order to protect the New Republic. You are champions of the Force." Though his students did not speak or respond, he felt the upsurge of their emotions, their swelling pride. There would be other students, new trainees who would come to his Jedi Academy. Luke had to face the fact that he might lose a few to the dark side. But the more defenders of the Force he could train, the stronger would be the legions of the light side. With a collective gasp, the gathered Jedi on the rooftop watched as the sun burst from the fringe of Yavin. Brilliant white rays gleaming like fire-facet gems sprayed across the jungle moon, reflecting and refracting from the swirling atmosphere. R2 whistled. Luke and the other Jedi simply watched in awed silence. The rainbow storm cast its glow over all of them as the dawn continued to brighten. About the author. After working for 10 years as a technical writer for one of the largest government research laboratories in the country, Kevin J. Anderson can honestly say he has never, ever met a brilliant but naive weapons scientist who even remotely resembles Qui Zux. Never in his career has he attended meetings as pointless or time-wasting as those described in this book. He has never worked for an incompetent manager as wrapped up in procedures and irrelevancies as Maw Administrator Tol Sivrim. And he has never told a lie in his entire life. On the other hand, he has written more than 150 short stories and over a dozen novels, including Lifeline, The Trinity Paradox, and Assemblers of Infinity, all with Doug Beeson, and his latest, Climbing Olympus, a novel about people adapting to the harsh environment of Mars. He has been nominated for both the Nebula and the Bram Stoker Awards. He has been to the top of Mount Lassen and the bottom of the Grand Canyon. He has been inside a Minuteman III missile silo and its underground control bunker, inside a plutonium plant at Los Alamos, New Mexico, on the floor of the Pacific Stock Exchange, out on an Atlas E rocket launch pad. His next Star Wars projects will be to edit 3 anthologies, Tales from the Mos Eisley Cantina, Tales from Jabba's Palace, and Bounty Hunters. This has been Star Wars, the Jedi Academy Trilogy, Volume 3, Champions of the Force, by Kevin J. Anderson. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed my reading of this audiobook and would like to contribute, you can head on over to www.patreon.com/theexpandeduniverselives forever. The link is also in the video's description.